Chapter Vrelion. The Bells of St. Ethelreda's. It was upon a chill and wind-bitten evening in late November of the year 1891 that I first heard the strange tale of the Bride of the Bell Tower. The fog, which all that day had rolled up from the river, now pressed thick and yellow against the windows of Baker Street, muffling the gaslight and dimming even the cheery glow of our hearth. Holmes sat opposite me, his long hawk-like face illuminated by the bluish flame of his spirit lamp, over which he bent with the absorbed air of a man wholly possessed by some intricate experiment. For my own part, I had resigned myself to the melancholy of the season. London, in its late autumn mood, possesses a dreariness that no man who has once endured it can easily forget. The shrill cries of the newsboys, the ceaseless clatter of hoofs in the mire of the roadway, and the oppressive pall of the fog combined to render even the stoutest spirit despondent. Yet my companion seemed curiously invigorated by it. Indeed, I have sometimes thought that Holmes drew his vitality less from the warmth of the sun than from the mist and mystery of London's darker corners. "Watson," said he suddenly, without raising his head, "you are restless. A sure sign that either my silence has wearied you, or that you are yearning for some new sensation." I smiled. "You do me injustice, Holmes. I was merely wondering what curious compound now claims your attention." He lifted the test tube to the light, watching a faint violet vapor curl upward. "An attempt, my dear fellow, to detect minute traces of arsenic in candle grease. It may yet serve as a useful adjunct to criminal detection. There are cases, and I could cite 2 within the past year, in which such an analysis might have turned suspicion into certainty." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson's discreet knock interrupted us, and she entered bearing a visiting card upon her tray. Holmes glanced at it, and his eyes brightened. "Show the lady up," said he. Then, turning the card between his fingers, he added with that half-smile I knew so well, "An applicant of character, Watson. Note the name, Mrs. Agatha Larkin of St. Ethelreda's Close, Westminster. A widow, I perceive, pious, punctual, and in mortal distress. There is a faint trace of candle wax upon the card, which our good housekeeper's polish has failed to remove, and the perfume of church incense. Depend upon it, she comes from ecclesiastical surroundings." A moment later our visitor was ushered in, a tall, austere woman in sombre dress, whose gloved hands trembled upon the handle of her parasol. Her countenance bore the pinched look of one long acquainted with anxiety. "Pray be seated, madam," said Holmes gently. "You could not have chosen a more fitting evening for a consultation. London's fogs seem made for mystery." She sank into the chair, her eyes flitting nervously about the room before settling upon my companion. "Mr. Holmes," she began, "I scarce know whether the matter I bring you is one for a detective or for a priest. Yet my conscience will not rest until I have spoken." "Then speak freely," said Holmes. "Dr. Watson is my friend and associate. You may trust him as you would myself." Her gloved hands clenched together. "It concerns the bells of St. Ethelreda's, and the young lady they have begun to call the Bride of the Bell Tower." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Indeed? The title has a certain grim poetry. Proceed, if you please." She took a breath, her voice steadier now. "I have been the housekeeper to the parish for over 15 years. Our vicar, the Reverend Mr. Percival Royston, is a learned and kindly man. A month ago he engaged a new bell ringer, a quiet fellow named Stephen Cray, lately returned from service in India. The bells had long fallen into disuse, you see, and Mr. Royston desired their peal to mark his silver jubilee." "Quite so," said Holmes. "And this Cray?" "He seemed respectable, sober, dutiful, though solitary. But within a week of his arrival, strange rumors began to circulate. Villagers spoke of hearing the bells toll at midnight, though no hand was upon the ropes. Then, last Tuesday, at precisely that hour, a dreadful cry was heard from the tower. When the verger and I reached it, we found Cray insensible upon the stair, muttering of a woman in white who had beckoned him from the belfry. Since that night he has lain in a fever, raving of the bride who waits above the bells." The woman shuddered. "And worse, sir, Yesterday, when the bells were silent, they tolled again of their own accord. I swear it upon my soul." Holmes regarded her with a grave and thoughtful expression. "You yourself heard the sound?" "I did, sir. So did half the close. The police have been summoned, but they treat it as village hysteria. Yet I know that something unholy walks that tower." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain. The fog pressed against the glass like the breath of some monstrous beast. "A church, a fevered witness, a phantom bride, and bells that ring themselves," he murmured. "An admirable assortment of elements, Watson. I begin to perceive the pattern." "Then you think there is an explanation?" I asked. "There is always an explanation," said he quietly. "The universe is rarely at a loss for causes, though it delights in clothing them with mystery. Tell me, Mrs. Larkin, has there been any recent interment connected with the church?" She started. "Why, yes, sir. A fortnight past. Miss Eleanor Marsh, daughter of Colonel Marsh, late of the Indian Army. She was to have been wed to Captain Lionel Dare, also of that regiment, but was found dead in her chamber the eve before the ceremony." "Heart failure," they said. Holmes turned sharply. "And the bells were rung for her funeral?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It was the first time in many years they had pealed." He nodded slowly. "The bride of the bell tower, then, may not be merely a village fancy." For some moments he stood in silence, his keen eyes half closed, the thin lips moving faintly as if framing unspoken calculations. Then he drew his cloak about him with decision. "Watson, we shall dine early. Mrs. Larkin, you will return to Westminster this evening and inform the Reverend Royston that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson will attend the morning service at St. Ethelreda's tomorrow. I would see these famous bells for myself, and if possible the place where your spectral bride is said to walk." The woman rose, visibly relieved. "Oh, thank heaven, Mr. Holmes. If anyone can lift this shadow, it is you." When she had gone, I could not suppress my curiosity. "You mean to visit the church?" "Assuredly. There is a singular odor about this case, Watson. The faint metallic taint of deceit. It clings to the facts as fog to the river. A woman dead on the eve of her wedding, a returned soldier of questionable antecedents, and bells that toll in the night. I fancy the solution will not be supernatural, but it may prove tragic." He smiled faintly as he reached for his violin. "Until morning, then. Let us soothe our minds with a little sarasate, for the bride of the bell tower waits, and I should not keep a lady waiting, even one from the grave." Chapter 2. The Shadow in the Belfry. The following morning broke with that washed pewter light peculiar to London after a night of heavy fog. It was not so much that the mist had lifted as that it had grown weary of its own density, and now drifted about the streets in torn banners that clung to lamp-post and the upper stories of the houses. Holmes was earlier than his custom, and I found him at the breakfast table with a cold chop untouched, a pile of correspondence laid out like a fan, and the Times folded to the births, marriages, and deaths. "Observe, Watson," said he, tapping the page with the handle of his spoon. "An announcement 3 weeks old. Captain Lionel Dare to wed Miss Eleanor Marsh, only daughter of Colonel Edmund Marsh, late of the 103rd Bengal Fusiliers ceremony to be held at St. Ethelreda's, Westminster." A commonplace line in a commonplace column, yet behind it stands a regiment of facts. The colonel is newly returned, the captain is presumably on half-pay, and there is a social stake sufficient to demand the renovation of neglected bells. That is not all. The printing is slightly smudged compared with the other entries of the day. "Meaning?" I asked. "That the notice was amended after going to press. A date altered, perhaps. Or a name. We shall see if that triviality has its echo in the tower." He swept the letters aside. "2 begging circulars, an invitation to lecture from the University of Lund, which I shall decline, and a note from Lestrade, promising to bring me a jewel of a case, if I will but endure his society. As our choir of bells has already begun its prelude, let us favour St. Ethelreda's first, and leave Lestrade to his own discord." We took a hansom and rattled westward through the thinning fog. I have more than once observed that Holmes's spirits rise with motion. He leaned forward in the cab, his long fingers drumming a noiseless tattoo upon his knee. His eyes kindled with that inward fire, which to me was the unmistakable sign of his faculties fully engaged. When we turned at last into the sombre narrowness of St. Ethelreda's Close, the church rose before us. A squat Norman tower shouldering a later nave, its stone blackened by city smoke and the damp fingers of time. The place had a curious hush upon it, as though sound entered softly and was there imprisoned. A few parishioners drifted toward the doors. A verger, gaunt and stiff as a halberd, hovered at the porch, and on the path under the yew stood Mrs. Agatha Larkin, clasping a reticule as though it were a talisman. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" she cried, relief and agitation warring in her features. "The vicar awaits you within. And perhaps you will have a glance at poor Mr. Cray after the service. The fever holds him yet." "With pleasure," said Holmes, bowing. "Forgive me if I take one turn around the exterior first. The physiognomy of a building is often franker than that of its occupants." He left us and paced slowly along the churchyard wall, his gaze lifting and dropping, lingering upon gutters and louvres as another man's might upon faces. I noticed him pause beneath the belfry slit, and with that curious feline grace which always astonished me in so spare a figure, he sprang upon the low buttress, leaned closer, and then, with a handkerchief drawn from his sleeve, delicately lifted something from the stone and slipped it into his pocket. When I joined him, he had already descended and was contemplating the churned mud of the path. "Boots, Watson," said he abstractedly. "Here a clergyman's square-toed. There a woman's narrow tread with a broken outer heel. And here the sharp, drilled step of a soldier, toe turned out, weight borne upon the ball. The churchyard knows its congregation as the street knows its crowd. Come, to our pew of observation." Within, St. Ethelreda's had the clean orderliness of a well-kept barracks. The morning light fell milkily through stained glass upon polished pew ends and memorial tablets. A faint breath of beeswax and incense drifted from the chancel. The Reverend Mr. Percival Royston was a man of 60, spare and scholarly, with a high brow and eyes that looked kindly, yet seemed to see more than kindness requires. He greeted us with a courteous anxiety, and after a word of welcome mounted to the reading desk. I confess there was something soothing in the simple service. The cadences of the psalms, the organ's gentle tide, the rustle of prayer books, all these worked upon my mind until the rough edges of the city morning were smoothed away. Yet I had not forgotten our errand, and more than once I saw Holmes's gaze slide from the vicar to the shadowed arch that yawned at the base of the tower, as a man's eyes will wander to a door from which he expects a messenger. At the close, Mr. Royston led us into the vestry, a low chamber with a press for vestments, a shelf of parish registers, and a kettle that steamed faintly upon a hob. A portrait of some long-dead benefactor, fat and complacent, looked down upon us from a tarnished frame. "You are most welcome, Mr. Holmes," said the vicar. "Mrs. Larkin has told me only that you are prepared to consider our absurdities. There are parishioners who even now whisper that a ghost has taken up residence in our tower." "Better a ghost than a scandal, vicar," Holmes murmured pleasantly. "Tell me of Mr. Stephen Cray." "A man of quiet habits and good skill," Royston replied. "He rang the quarter peal at Miss Marsh's funeral with appropriate solemnity. 3 nights later he was found upon the stair, insensible, and has scarcely recovered his wits since." "Who found him?" "Our verger, Mr. Kettle. An exact man, sometimes painfully exact." Holmes's eyes brightened as at the mention of a reagent. "We must have the pleasure of his exactitude, and the Marsh family." The vicar's face shaded. "Colonel Marsh worships with us, a stern gentleman, old school. His daughter was a lovely creature, full of reserve and sweetness. Captain Dare, Well, I have never cared for men who carry the parade ground into the drawing room. There is a vigour that is no cousin to gentleness. Holmes accepted the character with a nod. I shall first examine your tower, if I may. We passed from the vestry into the shadowed base of the belfry. A door of worm-soft oak gave upon a narrow spiral stair of stone that curled upward like the interior of a shell. The air there had a peculiar blend of odours: cold dust, old rope, the metallic tang of iron, and I fancied a faint sweetness, such as hangs about a conservatory in winter. Holmes paused, his nostrils quivering. You perceive it, Watson? Something floral, I ventured. But what of that? Churches are often garnished with lilies and wreaths, he finished. Yes, yet this is not the scent of flowers, but of essence, a distillate that clings where it has no business. Let us go cautiously. We mounted in single file. Halfway up, where the stair debouched upon a small landing with a slit of a window, we came upon the bell rope that descended through a glazed hole from the chamber above, a stout tarred line bound with a tuft of wool at the pulling place. Holmes bent to it, and with a care that would have befitted a surgeon on an artery, touched it with his finger, and then with the tip of his nose. He smiled without mirth and drew from his pocket a strip of paper, which he pressed to the rope, folding it afterward and stowing it away. You have found something? I asked. Only confirmation of a suspicion, said he lightly. Come. The bell chamber itself was a dim, cavernous room, where the great mouths of metal hung open in a wooden frame, their clappers poised like tongues that had forgot the art of silence. The floor was littered with dust, pigeon feathers, and a scatter of small objects that might once have been used for maintenance. Nails, a broken brush, a smear of verdigris upon a rag. In one corner stood a little settle with a cushion, and beside it an iron brazier, long cold. Holmes crossed directly to the casement, where a panel of leaded glass stood ajar. He examined the hinge, the sill, and the outer stone with his lens. Then, with a seeming indifference that deceived no one who knew him, he strolled toward the bells themselves, peering at the bolts that held them, the straps by which the ropes were married to the wheels, and the wheels' rims, where tar and grease had left black arcs. If your bells rang in the night, said he at last, they did so by means easily contrived. A slip line run through the Louvre to some external point, a weight dropped, a lever depressed. The world has always provided rope for those who seek to ring changes. You think, then, I began. I think nothing, he returned. I observe, and I observe that one of these wheels has been rubbed clean more recently than the others, that this casement, though now ajar, has the bright scratch of a latch newly forced, and that our pigeons, whose droppings spatter the south stone, have left the north intolerably pristine. A man who comes and goes by the north, Watson, will not be decorated by the south. He went to the settle and touched the cushion. Still faintly warm, though that may be the memory of yesterday's sun. He knelt, and from beneath the settle withdrew a small folded scrap. The ghost is a careful housekeeper. He opened the paper, glanced at it once, and without a word slipped it into his pocket-book. I confess my patience failed me. Holmes? In good time, said he. Our ghost is impatient, perhaps. We must not imitate him. Vicar, may we see Mr. Cray? Mr. Royston led us by way of a side door across the close to a narrow house that served, I gathered, as lodgings for certain church servants. In an upper room, where a little fire fought manfully with the chill, lay a young man with sallow cheeks and a soldier's moustache no longer at muster. His eyes had the glazed brightness of a fever, and his hands plucked ceaselessly at the coverlet. Mrs. Larkin hovered at the threshold. He wanders still, sir. At times he knows me. At others he cries out. Holmes seated himself at the bedside and took the man's wrist. Pulse high and irritable. The pupils. He shaded them with his hand. Sensitive. He smells faintly of... you have been dosing him with chloral, Mrs. Larkin. Only a few drops in milk, Mr. Holmes, at the doctor's order. Holmes inclined his head. "You have done as you were told, Mr. Stephen, can you hear me?" The man's lips moved. "She comes," he whispered. "White, above the bells, a lily in her hand. She beckons, and the ropes, oh God, the ropes!" "Do not be alarmed," Holmes said in a tone I have heard soothe stronger men. "When you saw her, were the bells ringing?" "Like the day of judgment," breathed the invalid. "Hollow, tolling, the air a-throb. And the scent. What did you smell?" Cray shuddered and turned his face toward the wall. "Garden after rain, the lily." Holmes rose. "We will trouble him no more. Rest is his best medicine. Rest and silence." On the stair he paused and looked back upon the small figure in the bed. "Mrs. Larkin, who sits with him by night?" "I do, sir, when the verger will spare me, and sometimes Mr. Kettle himself." "Very good. I shall have a word with Mr. Kettle now, if he can be found." The verger awaited us in the porch, as precise and upright as the vicar had promised. He was a spare man with a chin that might have been cut to measure for a clerical collar, and a voice that never seemed to rise above the register of reproof. "You discovered Mr. Cray upon the stair?" Holmes asked. "At 12 minutes before 1 by the vestry clock," replied the verger, "and at 13 minutes before by my own. He lay upon the landing as one dead, and a smell was in the air not proper to sacred places." "You notified the police?" "I notified the vicar," said Mr. Kettle with severity. "Only later, at his direction, did I admit the constable." "And these bells that ring themselves, have you heard them?" The verger's compressed lips thinned. "I am a man of sense, Mr. Holmes. I heard a noise such as might be made by ropes, wheels, and iron tongues. If there were hands, they were not mine." Holmes's eyes rested upon the man a fraction longer than politeness demanded. "You keep your ropes, Todd?" "I keep them as they should be." "And polish the wheels?" "When needful." "Indeed, you are a steward of conscience." "One last triviality. You have had lately to expel boys from the tower." "Twice, sir." "And I have mended the latch accordingly." Holmes thanked him with a nod and turned away. We had scarce quitted the close when a military figure swung briskly round the corner and checked upon seeing us. He was a handsome fellow in mufti, square-shouldered and trim, with sun upon his face where London had not yet done its whitening work. He lifted his hat, revealing close-cropped hair touched with premature grey. "Confound this mist," he said, half to himself. "Ah, the vicar told me of you. Captain Lionel Dare at your service. You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe." Holmes's bow was the precise degree colder than cordial. "I am. You will accept my condolences upon your bereavement." Dare's jaw worked once. "Thank you. If you imagine I put faith in these parish tales of spectres, you are wrong. Eleanor died of a heart complaint. The doctor said as much. These village fancies do her memory no honour." "The bells?" Holmes asked mildly. "A trick. Some wretch's trick. If I catch the author, I shall teach him a more salutary tune. May I ask where you were upon the night when Mr. Cray was found insensible?" A flush sprang to the captain's cheek. "At my club. There are gentlemen who will vouch for me." "Gentlemen can be as fallible as clocks," Holmes returned pleasantly. "Yet both are useful. How long had you been acquainted with Miss Marsh?" "2 years," he said shortly. "We met in Simla. I suppose you mean to inquire next whether there were rivals." "There were not." Holmes studied him with that curious quiet which often discomposed the most self-possessed. "Rivals are sometimes manufactured where none exist," he said. "Good morning to you, Captain." The man's heels clicked together with parade neatness, and he strode away. We found a cab and directed it toward Baker Street. For some minutes Holmes sat silent, his face turned to the window, his hands in his coat pockets. At length he drew out the folded scrap he had taken from beneath the settle and handed it to me. It was a fragment torn from a program of sacred music, such as might be distributed upon a Sunday. In a corner, written neatly in a feminine hand, were the words, "Meet, midnight, North Stair. Bring the lily." "Well, Watson," said Holmes softly. "It suggests a rendezvous," I said. "A woman. One who knew the tower, and something to do with the lily, which we have heard twice already. Just so. And what do you make of this? He passed me next the paper he had pressed to the rope. It bore a faint greasy smear, and at 2 points, a violet dusting like the lightest bruise. I cannot say. My little experiment of last night, he replied, sought to bind a reagent to a carrier surface, candle grease to speak plainly, and to discover whether certain substances leave a persistent bloom upon contact. The rope bears paraffinic grease infused with a scent, lilies, as our invalid observed, and the faintest trace of orpiment with a companion that would interest a toxicologist. Poison? I cried. A persuasion, said Holmes dryly. Enough upon the skin, oft repeated, would not kill a man, but it might set his nerves a-jangle and his heart to a disorderly beat. Add the darkness, the hour, the shock of a white figure, and the clangor of bells, and your stout ringer collapses upon the stare and babbles of brides. I stared. Then the haunting is the work of a living hand, he concluded, and the lily our ghost carries is not plucked from paradise, but from a chemist's shelf. There remains the instrument by which the bells are moved without a bell ringer, the path by which the visitor enters and departs without greeting Mr. Kettle's exactitude, and the small matter of motive. Captain Dare? I ventured. Possibly. He is a man who would kick open a door rather than find its latch. Yet not all wrongdoers are loud. Consider, too, the Colonel, a severe father with a dead daughter, and Mrs. Larkin, who treads softly in every room of this parish. Even a verger, Watson, is but a man with keys. He smiled sidelong. We have skimmed the cream. Now let us set the milk to stand. There will be a change of weather tonight. I can feel it in my bones and smell it in the river. When the wind shifts, St. Ethelreda's will sing us another verse. And our next step? I asked. First to pay our respects to Colonel Marsh, said he. Grief is a locked desk with many drawers. Sometimes it yields to the right touch. After that, he tapped the pocket where the scented paper lay. I fancy a midnight appointment of our own on the north stair. If the bride of the bell tower keeps tryst, it would be ungallant not to attend. He settled back, and the cab bore us northward through a city whose bells, for the hour, were innocent. Yet in my mind I heard again that imagined tolling above the sleeping close, and saw, as Cray had seen, a figure pale as mist and peril, a lily at her breast, and in her hand the rope that marries iron to fear. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Grief. The following afternoon found us on the south side of St. James's Park, where the trees, already half denuded by the chill winds of November, rattled their skeletal branches against a pewter sky. Colonel Edmund Marsh's residence stood in a terrace of handsome Georgian houses overlooking Birdcage Walk, the sort of dwelling which speaks, not of great wealth, but of old and honourable service. Its polished brass plate and neatly whitened steps told of discipline carried even into mourning. Holmes surveyed the facade with that swift, comprehensive glance which took in a building as another man might a printed page. "Observe, Watson," he murmured as the cab drew up. "The curtains drawn only upon the lower story, a sign that grief here observes the forms, but not the madness of despair. The blinds of the upper windows are half raised, as though the servants fear darkness even in daylight, a household divided between reverence and curiosity." "You mean," I said, "that they mourn decorously, but with an appetite for gossip?" "Precisely," said he, stepping out and ringing the bell. "And gossip, my dear fellow, is the small coin from which we mint our sovereign truths." The door was opened by a man of military bearing, grey-haired and expressionless, who ushered us into a narrow hall hung with regimental portraits and a faint odour of pipe tobacco. Presently the colonel himself entered, a tall, spare figure in a black frock coat, his back as straight as a bayonet. The lined face, tanned by old Indian suns, retained a certain iron vigour, though the eyes beneath the heavy brows were weary and bloodshot. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said in a voice that carried the tone of command even into sorrow. "And Dr. Watson? I have heard of you both. Mrs. Larkin's letter reached me this morning, though I confess I scarcely know what service you can render." "My daughter is dead, sir. No detective can undo that." Holmes bowed slightly. "You are quite right, Colonel. I cannot restore the dead, but sometimes one may restore the honor of the living, or the peace of the dead." The Colonel's fingers tightened on the head of his cane. "Peace of the dead?" he repeated harshly. "She lies in consecrated ground, if that is what you mean. I will have no talk of hauntings under my roof. The superstitions of servants and parish gossips do not concern me." Holmes's voice was calm, almost deferential. "And yet, Colonel, you have yourself heard the bells." The old soldier started slightly, and I fancied a tremor passed through the sinews of his jaw. "I heard a sound, a vibration of the air, one night last week," he said slowly, "but I gave it no more thought. Bells are made to ring, sir. I do not truck with phantoms." "Of course," Holmes said smoothly. "Then you will forgive my bluntness if I inquire into the circumstances of your daughter's death. You were in the house that night?" "I was," said the Colonel. His voice dropped a note, and his eyes moved toward the fire. "She retired early. There had been some slight disagreement, a trivial matter. She was high-strung, poor child. When her maid went to call her in the morning, she was lying as if asleep. The doctor, Simmons of Whitehall, pronounced it heart failure. She had never been robust, that is all." Holmes's gaze softened. The sympathy in it was genuine. "And Captain Lionel Dare." The Colonel's brows drew together. "Dare was a fine officer. I approved the match. He bore himself with the decorum of a gentleman, though I dare say he feels the loss more keenly than he shows." Holmes's tone turned reflective. "Did your daughter suffer any nervous distress in the days before her death? Any agitation, sudden faintness, or failure of appetite?" "She was not quite herself," the Colonel admitted reluctantly. "There was a letter, from someone in India, I believe. She burned it unread. Her maid told me as much. I did not inquire further. A gentleman does not examine his daughter's correspondence." "Very right, Colonel," said Holmes gravely. "But you will allow me to ask, have you preserved any of her possessions as they stood in her room?" The old man hesitated. "Her chamber is locked," he said at last. I have not entered it since the funeral. The key is here." He drew it from his waistcoat pocket and held it for a moment in his palm. "You may see it if you must. But I warn you, sir, I will have no prying into sacred things." Holmes inclined his head with grave respect. "I shall tread softly, Colonel." He turned to me. "Come, Watson. We shall rely upon your physician's discretion as well as your friend's." The late Miss Marsh's room lay upon the upper floor. It was a chamber of feminine taste, touched with that quiet luxury which speaks of a gentle nature. A silver-backed brush upon the dressing-table, a miniature of her mother in ivory tones, and upon the bed a coverlet embroidered with lilies of the valley. Holmes moved as delicately as a cat, noting each detail without seeming to do so. He paused before a tall wardrobe whose door hung slightly ajar, and stooped to examine the carpet near its base. Then, without comment, he took a pinch of the dust upon his finger and smelt it. "Paraffin," he murmured. "Yet here there is no lamp of that sort. Curious." At the dressing-table he found a small crystal vial, empty save for a residue of clear fluid that clung to the glass. He held it to his nostrils and then to the light. "The same scent," said he softly. "Lilies again. Our bride leaves her signature." I looked about the room. "Holmes, do you suppose—" "I suppose nothing," he interrupted. "But note, Watson, the angle of that mirror and the scorch upon the candle-stand beside it. There was once a flame here that burned long after it was meant to. Look also at the window latch." I crossed to it and saw, as he indicated, that the metal catch was bent slightly outward, as though forced from without. "She was not alone that night," Holmes said quietly. "Either she admitted a visitor, or one entered unbidden, and the candle, that would not die, kept vigil after she was gone." There was a reverence in his tone which forbade questions. He turned back toward the wardrobe and drew from the shadow a small, square envelope that had fallen between it and the wall. It was unsealed, and within lay a card embossed with the arms of the 103rd Bengal Fusiliers. Upon it, written in a man's hand, were the words, E. I must see you, for your sake and mine. Midnight, the Tower. L. Holmes replaced the card in its envelope and returned it to his pocket. The hand is that of Captain Dare, he said. Compare it with the signature upon this letter from his club which he left upon the vestry table. The resemblance is striking. Then she went to meet him, I said. Undoubtedly. The lilies, the hour, the tower, all are of a piece. Whether he met her there or another came in his stead remains to be seen. He locked the room behind us and returned the key to the colonel, who awaited us in the hall. You have seen? Said the old soldier grimly. Then you will agree there is nothing more to be said. On the contrary, said Holmes, there is much more, but it may be better said elsewhere. I shall not trouble you further, Colonel. My respects and my thanks. The colonel's eyes followed us to the door. Mr. Holmes, he said slowly, I do not believe in ghosts, but if you find that man Dare had aught to do with my child's death, God help him, for I will not. Holmes bowed again and made no answer. As our cab rattled away down the Mall, I could see that my companion was in one of those moods of abstraction which heralded the gathering of a storm within his mind. His lips moved soundlessly, his hands, long and nervous, traced invisible diagrams upon his knee. At last he spoke. Watson, the ghost of St. Ethelreda's wears a man's handwriting and a soldier's courage, yet she also wears a scent that belongs not to India, but to a London perfumer who serves a very different trade. I looked at him in astonishment. A perfumer? He smiled faintly. Aye. There is a shop in Soho that sells certain essences not meant for ladies' dressing tables, oils that glow faintly under chemical light and that serve less innocent purposes. The lily of our tale is among them. You think the scent was used to mask another odor? Perhaps. Or perhaps as a lure. But come. We have one call to make before nightfall. If I mistake not, we shall find our next clue where scents are weighed as dearly as sins, in the back room of a perfumer's shop near Rupert Street. He tapped the roof of the cab and leaned back, eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. The bride of the bell tower, Watson, is beginning to unveil her veil, and if we are to meet her upon her own ground, it must be before the bells toll again. Chapter 4. The Perfumer of Rupert Street. Evening had fallen by the time we reached Soho, and the district, with its restless mixture of the respectable and the raffish, was already stirring to its nocturnal life. The gaslights flared wanly in the drizzle, throwing wavering halos upon the pavement, while from the open doors of cafes and music halls there issued snatches of laughter, song, and the clatter of plates. The mingled odors of roasting chestnuts, cheap scent, and wet stone gave the air a strange, heavy perfume that clung to the senses like a dream one cannot shake. Holmes had drawn his collar high about his throat and pressed his hat low against the drizzle. His eyes, keen and restless, swept each shop front as we passed, until at length he halted before a narrow, dimly lit establishment squeezed between a tobacconist's and a dealer in oriental curiosities. A modest sign above the door proclaimed, in gilt lettering half effaced by grime, Vin Lenoir, Parfumeur et chimiste. A single gas jet burned within, casting a greenish glow upon rows of glass bottles that gleamed like spectral jewels. Holmes gave a brief nod. This, Watson, is the very hive I expected. Observe, the display is arranged for connoisseurs, not the passing fop. Lenoir sells discretion as well as scent. He pushed open the door, and a small bell tinkled somewhere in the gloom. The air within was heavy with mingled fragrances, musk, amber, patchouli, and that faint sweetness of lilies which by now had become almost sinister to my nostrils. From behind a curtain of beadwork there emerged a man of middle height, dark and smooth-featured, with a waxen complexion and a pair of small, calculating eyes that glittered like drops of oil. His speech carried the faintest trace of a French accent. "Monsieur," he said with a bow, "how may I have the pleasure? Something for the toilette? A gift, perhaps, for madame?" Holmes smiled amiably. "A gift, indeed. Though of a peculiar nature. I am told, Monsieur Lenoir, that you are something of an expert in essences both delicate and rare. I am interested in one known as Essence de Lis Blanc." The perfumer's eyelids flickered. "It is not much demanded, monsieur. A fragrance for the convent rather than the ballroom. Still, I may have a dram somewhere. It is costly. A blend of lilies, civet, and a trace of orpiment to hold the note." "Orpiment," I repeated. "That is an arsenical compound." "Mais oui," said Lenoir lightly. "In infinitesimal quantity, monsieur. Harmless. Like the arsenic in some ladies' face powders. It fixes the scent, makes it endure upon the skin. Without it the lily fades in an hour." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Endurance, yes. And would this essence, if spilt or rubbed upon rope or fabric, retain its odor for long?" Lenoir's brows lifted. "Days, perhaps. Why should one do so barbarous a thing to perfume?" Holmes's tone was careless. "Curiosity only. You sell much of it?" "Très peu. One small bottle last month. To a gentleman, I think. He paid in coin and gave no name." Holmes drew from his pocket the scrap of scented paper he had taken from the bell rope. "Would your trained nose recognize this?" The perfumer held it delicately, inhaled, and shrugged. "Oui, that is my Essence de Lis Blanc. But, how curious. There is another odor mingled with it. Something bitter, metallic. How do you say, a reagent, perhaps?" Holmes inclined his head. "You have been most obliging, Monsieur Lenoir. One last favor. Can you recall aught of the gentleman who purchased it?" Lenoir pursed his lips. "Tall, well-dressed, hands of one who does not labor. English, but with a scar here. He touched his left temple. He spoke little, paid well, and left at once." Holmes nodded slowly. "My thanks." As we stepped back into the street, the drizzle had thickened to a fine, persistent rain. Holmes paused beneath the gas lamp, drawing the brim of his hat lower to shield his face. "A scar upon the left temple, Watson. That is a curious adornment for a lover or a ghost. You recall Captain Dare's close-cropped hair. Did you note the faint white line above his brow? The relic, I imagine, of a saber cut." I started. "You think he purchased the scent?" "I think he purchased something," said Holmes grimly. "Whether the essence or the illusion, time will tell. But come. The night wears on, and we have an appointment with our phantom. There is much yet to learn from a rope, a tower, and a lily." We dined sparingly at a chop-house near Charing Cross, and by 10 o'clock were back in Westminster, the fog once more rising from the river in ghostly wreaths. The close lay almost deserted, save for a constable at the gate, who nodded as we passed. The church loomed above us, its tower a dark finger pointing at the clouded heavens. Holmes carried under his arm a small leather case, and in his pocket the little vial of reagent he had prepared earlier. His mood was that of a man poised upon the edge of discovery, cold, deliberate, yet with a suppressed current of excitement that made his eyes shine in the gaslight. "We shall enter by the vestry," he whispered, unlocking the side door with a key Mrs. Larkin had provided. "I have no wish to alarm the parish. Bring your revolver, Watson, not for ghosts, but for men who imitate them." The interior of the church was hushed and cavernous. The faint gleam of the altar candles cast long, wavering shadows across the pews. Somewhere high above, the wind moaned softly through the louvres, giving the uncanny illusion of voices whispering among the bells. Holmes moved with soundless precision, his lantern hooded. We ascended the spiral stair to the belfry, the stone steps glistening damply beneath our feet. When we reached the landing, he paused and raised a hand. "Listen." From far above came a faint metallic creak, as of rope shifting against wood. Then silence. "Someone is there." I breathed. Possibly, Holmes murmured, or possibly the wind. In either case, let us be the first to see. He extinguished his lantern and motioned me to remain in the shadow of the wall. Then, noiseless as smoke, he ascended the final steps and disappeared through the trap that led into the bell chamber. The minutes that followed seemed an eternity. The air grew close, the silence oppressive. Then came a soft sound, a whisper of movement, followed by the dull thud of a rope stirred against the wheel. I caught my breath. Suddenly the bells above gave a single hollow note, deep and mournful as a groan. A second followed, and then another, each separated by a space of stillness that made the sound all the more dreadful. I sprang up the steps just as Holmes's lantern flared again. At its edge stood a figure, white-draped, motionless, and unmistakably feminine, a lily gleaming in one pale hand. "For God's sake, Holmes!" I cried, drawing my revolver. He caught my arm sharply. "Hold your fire, Watson. The dead seldom bleed." With a swift motion he unhooded the lantern fully, flooding the chamber with light. The apparition recoiled, and I saw that it was no ghost, but a woman, her face hidden by a white veil, her form shrouded in a bridal gown yellowed with age. The lily trembled in her hand, the other clutched a coil of rope. Holmes stepped forward. "Madam, or miss, your masquerade is at an end." The figure wavered, then dropped the flower and uttered a cry that was half sob, half defiance. You should not have come." The voice, though choked with emotion, was that of youth, and unmistakably English. Holmes reached out and drew aside the veil. Beneath it was revealed a face pale as marble and wild with fear, that of a girl scarcely 20. Mrs. Larkin, or rather a younger, unmasked version of her, for it was the same woman, though years and gentleness had since altered her features. Holmes's voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. "You are not Mrs. Larkin, but her daughter." The girl sank upon the settle, trembling. "Yes," she whispered, "Agnes Larkin, her daughter, though none here know of it. She sent me away to service in the country. But when I heard of Miss Marsh's death, I came back. I had to know, to see if it was true what they said, that Captain Dare had murdered her." Holmes regarded her keenly. "And the bells?" "I meant only to frighten him," she said, the words tumbling out in a torrent. "He used to come here, to the tower, where he met her. I thought if I could make him think she haunted the place, he might confess, or flee, or lose his reason. I found her gown in the vestry, the one she was to be married in. I knew the ropes, for my mother kept the keys. I rigged a cord to the outer stair and pulled it from below. But then Mr. Cray came instead. He saw me, and I cried out, and he fell." Her voice broke into sobs. Holmes laid a hand gently upon her shoulder. "Compose yourself, Miss Larkin. You have erred gravely, but not wickedly. Tell me, who gave you the perfume?" She looked up startled. "I found it in her room. I thought it was hers. Her bridal scent. I did not know it would make him ill." Holmes's expression softened. "Nor did you know it might have killed another?" She stared at him, bewildered. "Killed? You mean—" But Holmes merely shook his head. "We must see you safely from here first. Watson, take her below. The air here is poison to both heart and conscience." I obeyed, leading the trembling girl down the narrow stair, while above us the bells swayed faintly in the draught, their iron throats whispering to one another in the darkness. When we reached the vestry, Holmes rejoined us, lantern in hand. "She must be kept from Captain Dare," he said quietly. "There is more in this than superstition. Watson, we are dealing with a crime born not of madness, but of calculation." He turned to the girl. "You shall return to your mother's care tonight. Fear nothing. I will see that no charge is brought against you. But one last question. Who, besides yourself, knows of the tower's north door?" She hesitated. "Only Mr. Kettle, the verger. He keeps the key." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Ah, the verger again. Good. Then our next vigil, Watson, shall be shared with him, for though our bride has shed her veil, the groom, I fancy, still walks free. Chapter 5. The Hidden Rope. That night's vigil left me with the particular exhaustion that follows a long tension rather than hard exertion. Even so, I believe I had not slept above 3 hours when Holmes's hand fell upon my shoulder, and I woke to see him fully dressed, a cup of steaming coffee in one hand and a coil of thin, tar-blackened cord in the other. "My apologies, Watson," said he, as if rousing a man at noon rather than before the winter dawn, "but the tide waits for no man, nor does an attaching knot. Drink that, put on your stout boots, and bring your old army cloak. We have a meeting with a gutter." "A gutter?" "A parish gutter," he returned serenely. "One that has lately acquired the habits of a conspirator. 10 minutes, if you please." The light which comes before sun-up struggled wanly at the edges of the London fog as we rattled back to St. Ethelreda's. The close had that chill, abandoned air a city wears in the small hours. A sparrow's scratch in a hedge, a constable's cough at the gate, and otherwise the breath of London itself. A slow, sour whisper under all. Holmes had with him his little leather case of implements, my service revolver having been left in my pocket by his recommendation. He added now a pair of India rubber-soled shoes to the array. "We shall tread like cats," said he, handing me a pair. "Sound travels up stone as if the tower were an ear." We passed the sleeping vestry and came into the small green where the north face of the tower rose in a sheer soot-black wall. Holmes stood quite still, head canted as if listening for the memory of a sound. Then he knelt beside the base course, ran his fingers along the mortar, and smiled. "Note, Watson, new pointing disguised under old grime. When thieves fall out, honest men come by their own, they say. I prefer, when a mason grows honest, a thief grows nervous. Feel here." The mortar, where he indicated, had that faint sandpaper rasp which tells of recent work. He produced from his pocket a thin-bladed tool, slipped it into a seam, and with an almost affectionate patience teased out a plug of stone hardly larger than a shilling. Behind it lay a hollow scarcely wider than a man's thumb, and within the hollow a smear of black tar and a shaving of fibre pale as straw. "Rope's nest," Holmes murmured. "A clever man will make his tower into a pulley house and then hide the string in the wall. See the tar? Our bell's wheels are tarred, and the fibre is not hemp, but manila. Sea-going stuff, tougher and more elastic. Who rings London bells with manila, Watson?" "A sailor or a soldier long at sea," said I, thinking of our scar-templed captain and of the possibility, spoken but not yet weighed, that Mr. Kettle had seen decks as well as pews. "Just so," said Holmes with a glint. "Now for the higher end." He led me round to the angle buttress on the north, where last we had seen the pigeon-spattered stones conspicuously clean. The buttress rose in 2 steps, like a ladder flattened and turned to stone. Holmes, whose wiry strength has always astonished me, went up the first ledge with the ease of a cat, then drew from his pocket a small hook of tempered steel with a leather thong attached. With this he snagged the iron stanchion of the Louvre slit a few feet above and steadied himself. "Up, my dear fellow. The grip is sure." I followed with less elegance but sufficient prudence, and so we found ourselves breast-high at the Louvre, whose leaded panes had been propped with a pebble to stand half an inch proud of the rebate. Holmes slipped the pebble into his pocket, then drew his lens and examined the wood. Even in that pallid light I could see faint scars where a line had been dragged over, and at one point a deeper groove where a knot had bitten. He produced the coil he had shown me at dawn, and paid out a yard of it, laying the free end over the groove, measuring like a tailor across a client's shoulder. "A twin," he said. "The same lay, the same tar, and see—" He passed the cord into my fingers. A whipping upon the bitter end done in the Methodist fashion, a plain back splice with the cut tapered. Clergymen learn neatness of more than souls. "You accuse the verger," I whispered. "I accuse a hand acquainted with church ropes, who has time to tar them and to keep a conscience like a ledger," he returned. "But let us not be premature. Proof must be as clean as his collars." With the same feline certainty, he drew himself level with the slit, peered in, and then made a curious little leap with his eyes, as though sight had been a spring beneath his feet. "They last inch, Watson," said he softly. "Come up and behold the marriage of bell and gutter." I gained the slit and looked. Inside, the northmost bell wheel showed a faint, newer polish upon the outer rim. Upon the axle's near end a small iron eye had been screwed, bright with recent use, and through that eye a thinner line, hardly more than twine, had been reeved, its course vanishing into the dark where the joists lay. The twine fished out again a foot farther, passed under the wheel's rim, and went to the casement, where a little notch in the wood had been cut to keep it from riding, and so to the Louvre edge, our groove. "The contrivance of a patient mind," Holmes breathed, "a twine messenger to a Manila servant. Outside, our man hauls upon Manila, which draws the twine, which moves the wheel, which sets the bell to kiss its tongue. No need for a ringer in the room, no creak of boot upon stair, only a whisper at the Louvre. Add a wait on the far end when one desires a tolling unattended, and there is your ghost's voice. And when the constable shines his lantern, there is nothing to be seen," I added, thinking of the terrified stories we had heard. "The rope is let go, the weight drags it out through the slit, and a clever finger tucks away the end in a hole at the base course." Holmes's smile held no merriment. "It is an old lesson, Watson. Where sound travels, so may string. Now we must follow that string to its confederate." He dropped lightly to the ground, and I after him. Skirting the north wall, he set himself to study every object that might serve as a temporary mooring: a rain-pipe collar, a rusted ring in the stone, the iron shoes of the buttress. He paused at the base of a downspout whose lead showed a faint polish as if hands had embraced it often, and where upon the grass a series of dimples hinted at a coil laid and taken up. "Mark the spacing," said Holmes, laying his hand against the grass as a tracker will lay his cheek to a rail. "Manila is thicker than twine. Its memory leaves the ground with an appetite to be believed. And see, here, what have we?" He plucked from the grass a tiny sliver of paper, translucent with damp, upon which in violet ink remained the fragment of a printed stave. His eyes twinkled. "The program again. Our ghost makes her hands clean with sacred music, it seems, and a fleck." With the tip of his knife he lifted from the downspout collar a shimmer so small I should have missed it had he not held it to the meager light. A crystal glint, like crushed sugar. "Resin," he said, tasting it. "Not pine. Copal, such as a certain French chemist might sell to fix a scent. Our lily has been asked to cling to lead." We were interrupted by the measured tread of a man whose feet had learned to be dignified. Mr. Kettle, the verger, appeared out of the mist with a lantern whose beam sliced the grey like a sword through gauze. He started upon seeing us at the base of his tower, then assumed that air of proprietorship which is the vestment of all vergers. "Gentlemen," said he chillily, "the hour is unseasonable for inspection." "On the contrary," Holmes returned pleasantly, "it is the very hour at which mischief has been afoot in your precincts. Your Louvre is cut, your downspout buffed like a beetle's cane, and your base courses carry little secrets no stone should boorishly swallow. Will you not share your lantern? A shared light is a shared conscience." The man stiffened. "If you accuse me—" "If I accused you, Mr. Kettle," Holmes said, the amiability thinning to iron, "I would have placed my hand upon your wrist rather than my words upon the air. For the moment I require only your keys to the north door, and a minute of your exact memory." Kettle's face worked. He made a small bow of affronted rectitude and produced the ring of keys. "I serve the church," said he, "and those she admits." Holmes took the keys, selected one with a speed which told me he had already observed the worn teeth, and led the way to a low-arched postern in the shadow of the transept. The lock turned sweetly, too sweetly, thought I, for disuse, and we stood upon a little stair that mounted, not to the belfry, but into the thickness of the wall, thence by a narrow passage to the outer platform beneath the Louvre. A slit walk, barely broad enough for a man's shoulders. Holmes's lantern, shaded, sent a soft glow ahead. On the stones lay the dust of centuries, disturbed. I saw as plainly as if in a surgeon's print the half-moons of boot heels and the more delicate arcs where a coil had been set down and taken up. At one point the dust was smoother, as a man had knelt and reached. Upon the sill of the Louvre, a new nick cut at the exact place where our groove aligned. Kettle stood behind us like a carved thing. Yet even carved things have grain, and in his there was a knot. Holmes found it by the simple expedient of turning, lantern lowered, and in that aura of dim fire, fixing the verger with a gaze as cold as a lancet. "At 12 minutes before 1 upon the night Mr. Cray was found," said Holmes. "Where were you?" "In my bed," returned the verger a shade too quickly. "And upon the night the bells tolled without permission?" "In my bed," came the same answer with the same rasp of indignation. Holmes's tone remained courteous. His words acquired, I thought, the exact measurement of the man he addressed. "Mr. Kettle, your boots carry the dust of this passage. Your keys kiss this lock. Your tar graces these ropes. I make no charge. I ask only, who comes here by your consent? A man with a sabre cut upon his temple, or another with India in his voice and grief in his heart?" The verger's face paled and then hardened, like wax near a flame, and then removed. "You are out of bounds, sir," he said in a voice that shook. "Ye will not be catechized." "Then be thanked," Holmes returned dryly, "for your lantern." He moved past the man and descended. Outside again he breathed once deeply, as though exchanging the church's stale suspicion for London's honest damp, and drew me aside. "The verger is a chest with a strong lock," he said. "We shall not force it today, but the rope we have found will tell more than his tongue." He set to work with the brisk economy I have seen in him at the bedside of a dying. Truth. From his case he produced a small tin of graphite, a linen tape, and a pair of thin gloves. He dusted the groove at the Louvre and the nick upon the sill, then laid over each a strip of gummed paper which he pressed and peeled with a surgeon's delicacy. Upon the papers 2 parallel smears appeared, one showing minute striations as if a cord of many fine filaments had rasped the wood, the other a narrower burnish. "Messenger and servant," said he, pleased. "I shall compare these with the twine on the wheel, and with this." He lifted the manila coil once more, "which I acquired at dawn from a rather embarrassed chandlery in Horseferry Road." "A small sale last fortnight," said our honest tarmonger, "to a gentleman in black who spoke like a clerk and paid without haggling." He remembered also a pair of gloves with the fingers stained violet. Our Lily again. "You think Kettle bought it?" "I think the purchase was made either by him or in his company. He is exact, yes, but exact men grow upon habits as shells grow upon rocks, and such habits leave rings. We shall count them presently." We had reached the vestry when the door opened upon a gust of cold, and the Reverend Royston entered, his gentle face troubled. "Mr. Holmes," he said, closing the door quickly as if to keep outside some shame as well as the damp. "I am disquieted. Captain Dare is abroad in the close like a soul without a bed. He has demanded admittance to the tower, and when denied used words at which charity must blush. I fear an altercation." Holmes's eyes lit with that frosty little spark I have learned to read as opportunity rather than anger. "Capital," said he. "Conscience that jingles its spurs is easily overheard. Will you indulge me in a small arrangement, Vicar? We shall give the captain rope, of a respectable kind, and see whether he swings himself, or another." The cleric, puzzled but trusting, agreed. In a few minutes Holmes had the church arranged as if for a little sacrament of truth. The north door remained locked. The key sat upon the vestry table in plain view. The stair was clear, the bell-chamber lantern extinguished, and at the Louvre our detective had fixed, by means I shall not here detail lest evil men profit, a hair-fine strand of his own which would break at the lightest pull, and so mark a hand more certainly than ink upon paper. He stationed me in the shadow of the porch with instructions to observe the captain's manner should he arrive. The vicar he placed near the gate, and for himself he took, as was his wont, the post least comfortable, a narrow perch upon the stair where dust and truth accumulate in equal measure. We had not long to wait. The fog parted like a pair of curtains, and Captain Dare strode into the close, his jaw set, his eye bright in a manner that, had it been upon parade, might have earned him praise. He saw the vicar and bore down upon him. "Sir," he said, saluting with an ironical precision, "I am told that a woman, a lunatic, a harpy, has been permitted to play tricks with the memory of one who was dear to me. I mean to enter that tower and put an end to this mummery. Your verger refuses me. I request your authority." "I cannot grant it," the vicar replied with quiet firmness. "The keys are under my control, and until this disturbance is resolved, no one enters the tower save by Mr. Holmes's leave." Dare's gaze shifted, quick and wolf-like. It lit upon me in the porch. I met it squarely. He flicked me the bow a man gives a stranger on a dueling field, then stepped past and, with the abruptness of a man who would rather do than speak, thrust into the vestry. Holmes had been at pains to place the key where it could be seen, and where any hand would betray itself in the taking. Dare saw it, hesitated for the space of a breath, then set his jaw and reached. I was at his shoulder in an instant. He started, then laughed harshly. The famous Dr. Watson, forgive my impetuosity. I shall apply to your colleague for leave to pay my respects to the bells." "The bells have had enough respect for one night," said Holmes, who had appeared as if conjured by the man's voice. "But the key is very willing, too willing, perhaps. You have a mark above your left temple, Captain. Does it itch when a man speaks of midnight?" Dare's hand went to the scar by instinct. I watched the color shift beneath the skin as a cloud shifts across a field. "It itches when my patience is tried," said he curtly, "and yours tries it, sir." "As truth tries all," Holmes answered smoothly. "Nevertheless, you will oblige me by allowing Mr. Kettle to accompany you should you mount. He is the guardian of the fabric and of the proprieties. We should not wish the bells to toll themselves again under misapprehension." A flicker, no more, passed between the captain's eye and the doorway where the verger hovered, stiff as rule. It was gone so swiftly that, had I not been trained by long observation, I might have ascribed it to the dance of the lantern. But Holmes saw it. I could tell by the infinitesimal lift of his nostril. "By all means," Dare said, forcing a smile. "Let the verger attend. I have nothing to hide." "Admirable," Holmes murmured. "Then let us ascend." We mounted in file, Holmes first, then Dare, then the verger, with me bringing up the rear. The stair seemed more narrow than ever, with the captain's impatience close before me, and the verger's rigidity close behind. At the landing, Holmes paused, turned his lantern to the rope, and with a feather-light touch laid 2 fingers where yesterday he had pressed his reagent paper. "A clean rope is the pride of a church," said he conversationally. "One can tell by its cleanliness who loves it most." Dare made an impatient sound. "By heaven, sir, if this is to be a lecture upon "It is to be a demonstration," returned Holmes, and with that unhooded his lantern at the level of the Louvre. The light showed a thing so slight that only a hunter of motes would have noticed it. The snapped end of a hair-fine thread caught upon the inner notch he had cut, its twin half clinging to the wood as a spider's film clings to a thorn. It trembled in the lantern's warmth, bright as a little line of frost. "Someone has pulled," said Holmes quietly, "and therefore someone has been here since dawn. That someone either keeps the keys." His eyes rested a heartbeat upon Kettle, whose face was rigid innocence, "or knows where they are set. How clever of our captain to present himself at the very hour the evidence ripens." Dare's mouth thinned. "If this is an accusation—" "It is an observation," Holmes snapped, and for the first time that day a shard of his steel rang on stone. "Accusations wait for facts." And facts, Captain, cling to lilies, as surely as a certain essence clings to rope. There came then from below the vicar's voice raised in alarm, a scuffling and the rapid footfall of a lighter tread. Holmes swung upon his heel with such speed I was near to colliding with him on the stair. "Down," he said. "The business shifts to the floor of the church." We found at the bottom Agnes Larkin, pale and wild-eyed, her cloak misbuttoned, her breath coming in desperate little gasps. She clung to the vicar's sleeve and cried, when she saw Holmes, "They have taken it! The gown is gone!" Holmes's eyes flashed once like flint to steel. In that spark I knew that some piece, small yet central, had fallen into his hand. "The gown," he said very softly. "Our candle that will not die. Then, Watson, the rope is hidden and the bride is stolen. Excellent, the ceremony is ready." He turned to the vicar. "Mr. Royston, lock every door. Not a cat nor a captain leaves this close without my leave. The thief is in our company, and the thing stolen is more eloquent than any witness." He glanced up the stair to where Dare and Kettle stood frozen as carvings. "Gentlemen," he added in a voice now cool, now courteous, now merciless, "our next act requires an altar, a lily, and a very small match. And to me, in a lower tone that could not be gainsaid, the hidden rope we have, now for the hidden fire." Chapter 6. The Candle That Would Not Die. Dawn had scarcely lifted its pale eyelid above the horizon when Holmes, restless as a falcon that scents its prey, stood once more amid the solemn hush of St. Ethelreda's nave. The fog of the previous night had been beaten back by a wind off the river, leaving the air sharp as steel and every window pane bright with frost. Yet inside the church there lingered an oppression no weather could dispel, a tension that seemed to hang from the vaulted roof like an invisible weight. The Reverend Royston, anxious and unshaven from a sleepless night, hovered near the vestry door. Agnes Larkin sat upon a bench, her eyes red but her manner calmer. Beside her, Mrs. Larkin herself had arrived at dawn, wringing her hands and whispering fervent prayers. Captain Dare and the verger, Mr. Kettle, stood apart at the chancel rail, each man rigid, watchful, and visibly smouldering under Holmes's cold, unhurried scrutiny. Holmes moved among them with that quiet authority peculiar to him when a case was nearing its end. Every detail of his appearance bespoke tension held in check. The flicker of the eyes, the drawn lips, the hands that never rested. From his coat he produced a small tin box, which he placed upon the vestry table beside a tall, brass candlestick. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, "we are met here, not for worship, but for revelation. A crime of subtle malice has been wrought beneath these sacred stones. I propose, before the hour strikes 8, to show you the hand that wrought it." The vicar looked distressed. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, this is a house of God. If there is to be accusation, let it not be—" Holmes lifted one long forefinger. "No accusation, only demonstration. You, Reverend, shall be witness, not judge." He turned to me. "Watson, your matches, if you please." I handed them over. Holmes struck one, and as the flame steadied, he touched it to the candle upon the table. The wax flared readily enough, but its glow was strangely tinted, an eerie blue at the edges, and the smoke that rose from it bore that now too familiar sweetness. Lilies, faintly tainted with something metallic and unwholesome. "Recognize the scent, Watson?" he asked. I nodded. "The same that clung to the bell rope, and to Miss Marsh's chamber." "Precisely. This candle was prepared with the same substance, essence de lis blanc, fixed with arsenical salts and a trace of phosphor. Observe." He extinguished the flame with a breath. Instantly, in the shadowed nave, the wick continued to glow, a sickly ember that pulsed, leaving though no air fed it. Then slowly it reignited, a faint tongue of blue fire licking upward, independent of match or hand. "The candle that would not die," Holmes said softly. "It burned thus in Miss Marsh's room the night she was found dead. It burned long after the window was forced, It filled the air with this fatal perfume, and when the heart of a delicate woman beat within it, he snapped his fingers. The flame had its sacrifice. A murmur went through the little group. Mrs. Larkin clutched her daughter's arm and began to weep. The vicar made the sign of the cross involuntarily. Holmes's gaze swept to Captain Dare. "You supplied the perfume, sir. Bought from Lenoir of Rupert Street. For what purpose?" Dare's face darkened. "For none of which you have dreamed. I bought it as a gift. For her. Eleanor loved lilies. She asked me for the scent. When last we met." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed she did ask for it, but not of you. This vial," he drew from his pocket a small crystal bottle, "was found in a chamber, half used. You see the residue? A mixture identical to that upon the candle and the bell ropes, but applied by another hand. It was you, Captain, who delivered the perfume. Yet it was not you who weaponized it." He swung round sharply. "Mr. Kettle, step forward." The verger obeyed with stiff movements. His face had grown a shade grayer, but his eyes were defiant. "You served in the merchant service, I believe?" Holmes asked. "A seaman once, yes. I have long repented it." "A penitent's virtue is often a sailor's knot, tight but easily cut. You knew the properties of tar and rope, of grease and oil. You alone possessed keys to every door of this church. And you, Mr. Kettle, were the last to see Miss Marsh alive." The man started violently. "That is a lie." "Is it?" Holmes's voice cracked like a whip. "You were sent that night by the vicar to place fresh candles in the Lady Chapel. You entered through the north door, where the latch shows your repair. You carried with you a taper touched with your special wax, a phosphoric mixture you used to relight lamps without flint. You set one upon the bride's dressing table. I did no such. And when she returned, she found you there. You told her Captain Dare waited in the tower, that he begged one last word before the morrow's wedding. She trusted you. You had known her from childhood. You led her through the close, unlocked the north door, and up the stair. There you left her in darkness, and from the stair below you pulled upon your hidden rope. The bells began to toll. The air filled with your poison scent, and her heart, already weakened by fright and the fumes, ceased its labor. Then you carried her body back by the same way and laid it upon her bed as though sleep had overtaken her." The verger's lips moved soundlessly. The vicar had sunk upon a bench, pale as parchment. Only Holmes's voice, cool and inexorable, filled the vast space. "But even then your work was incomplete. You would make it seem that the tower itself demanded her, that she was drawn by the spirit of those bells you loved more than any living creature. So when gossip awoke, you rang them again, secretly by your cunning contrivance, to keep the tale alive. You had a disciple in Captain Dare's jealousy and an unwitting accomplice in poor Stephen Cray, who stumbled upon your masquerade and nearly paid for it with his life." Holmes's tone softened for an instant. "You had served here 20 years. You saw her grow from child to woman. When she chose another, your devotion curdled into something darker. That, Mr. Kettle, was your crime. Love turned to idolatry." The man's composure snapped. "You cannot prove it," he burst out. "There is no proof, only your devil's guesses." Holmes's thin smile appeared. "Proof? You carry it on your hands." He lifted the candle and held it close to the verger's trembling fingers. "See how the flame brightens at his touch, Watson. The phosphor clings still to his skin. And here, beneath his nails, the violet stain of Lenoir's fixative. That will serve the police better than confession." Kettle shrank back, staring at his hands as if they were alien things. Then, with a sudden cry, he broke from us and ran up the nave. Holmes darted after him like an arrow, but before either of us could intercept him, the verger had flung open the north door and vanished into the chill morning. We followed at once, but the fog had returned with stealthy speed, rolling off the river in dun-colored waves. The sound of running footsteps echoed once, twice, and then ceased abruptly. When at last we reached the churchyard wall, we found him lying upon the frost-rimed grass, a dark patch spreading beneath his head where it had struck the stone curb. The fall had been short, but the angle cruel. He was quite dead. Holmes knelt beside him, fingers upon the wrist that would never again toll a bell. His face, when he rose, was grave, but not unkind. "So ends the verger of St. Ethelreda's," said he. "In death, as in life, faithful to his tower, he has taken his last toll upon himself." We returned to the church in silence. Captain Dare stood motionless near the chancel, his hat crushed between his hands. "Then Eleanor, she was murdered," he whispered, "by a man who believed himself her saviour." Holmes replied, "You have your honour intact, Captain. Guard it better than you guarded her." The soldier bowed his head. "I shall leave England," he said hoarsely. "There is no place here that does not echo her name." Agnes Larkin, her eyes wide with pity, moved forward to lay a small white lily upon the table beside the extinguished candle. "For her," she murmured, "and for him, if heaven can forgive." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Heaven, Miss Larkin, is more merciful than justice." Later that morning, as we sat once more before our familiar fire in Baker Street, I ventured to ask the question that had haunted me through the grey journey home. "Holmes," said I, "how in heaven's name did you divine the use of that infernal candle?" He smiled faintly. "By its persistence. You recall the faint scorch upon Miss Marsh's dressing-stand? A candle that gutters and dies leaves wax, not fire. Yet there was fire, too long for chance. When I found upon the candlestick the same resin that fixed the perfume, the rest followed. Lenoir supplied the scent, Kettle adapted it to his chemical lore. His hand was betrayed not by malice but by neatness. Every tarred rope, every polished latch, every precisely mended crack cried, 'I am exact.' Such men always leave the straightest. Clue." He leaned back, the faintest sigh escaping him. "It is a wretched business, Watson. There was devotion in it, perverted but human. The same flame that lights the altar can also burn the soul." I looked into the fire, where the coals pulsed red and blue like the heart of that cursed candle. "And the bride of the bell tower?" Holmes's gaze followed mine. "A legend now," he said quietly. "Let her rest so. The bells will ring again, under other hands, and London will forget. But I shall not. There was music in those bells, Watson, tragic yet just. They tolled not for love alone, but for vanity, pride, and a heart too weak for both." He reached for his violin, tuned one string, and drew the bow softly across it. The note hung pure and solitary in the air, then faded like a sigh into the quiet of Baker Street. Chapter 7. The Aftermath in Baker Street. It was 3 days after the events at St. Ethelreda's that I took up my pen to record the strange sequence of incidents now known to the public as the Bride of the Bell Tower case. London, fickle and voracious as ever in its appetite for sensation, had already seized upon the story with a kind of morbid relish. The morning papers spoke solemnly of the Phantom Bride of Westminster, of the Bell Tower poisoner, and of a startling revelation in clerical circles. They gave only the shadow of the truth, yet even that shadow was enough to chill the hearts of their readers and fill the coffee-houses with a week's worth of gossip. Holmes, for his part, remained utterly unmoved by the excitement he had caused. He lounged in his chair at Baker Street, dressing-gown loosely belted, a cigarette between his lips, and a copy of the Lancet open upon his knee. The familiar surroundings, the ticking of the clock, the clink of Mrs. Hudson's china, the thin grey light sifting through the curtains, seemed curiously unreal after the gloom and sanctity of St. Ethelreda's. Yet there was something in Holmes's expression which told me that, though the case was closed to the world, it was still very much open in his mind. I had been reading aloud an article from the Standard in which the anonymous writer, with all the ignorance of his craft, attributed the discovery of the crime to a mysterious informant known only to the police, and added that a consulting detective, whose name we suppress at the request of Scotland Yard, is rumoured to have rendered minor assistance. Holmes laughed softly. A modest acknowledgment, Watson. Our fame, it seems, rises and falls with the discretion of editors. I thought you would be pleased, said I. You have often declared that you dislike notoriety. True, he replied, but I confess to preferring silence for its own sake, rather than for the satisfaction of a fool's misreport. Still, I shall survive it. He stretched his long legs toward the fire, and drew from the mantel a small glass vial, the same I recognized that had contained the fatal perfume. Turning it in his fingers, he regarded it with a kind of detached melancholy. There lies, said he, the epitome of human folly, innocence distilled into corruption, purity made poisonous. Consider it, Watson, a scent designed to please, perverted into a weapon, a devotion meant for the divine, turned upon a mortal. I have encountered crimes more cunning, but few so pitiful. You pity the man, then? I asked. Holmes's gaze lingered upon the fire before he answered. I do not condone his deed, but I understand its genesis. Kettle's was no vulgar villainy born of greed or revenge. It was the obsession of a man who loved order more than life itself, a love of structure, ritual, and sanctity, carried to such a pitch that when one pure note in his cathedral of devotion rang false, he must strike the whole chord into silence. To him Miss Marsh was not a woman, but a symbol. When she chose another, she shattered his idol, and he, like so many who mistake worship for love, sought to rebuild the idol with her death. There was in his voice a depth of feeling that startled me. You speak almost tenderly, Holmes. He smiled faintly. It is easier to be tender toward a man who has destroyed himself than toward one who prospers by wickedness. Besides, he tapped the vial, this case touched something I cannot wholly name, perhaps because its instruments, sound, scent, and light, were of that delicate order which appeals to the artist rather than the brute. There is a terrible poetry in such a crime, Watson. One must resist it, lest pity turn to fascination. He rose abruptly as if to shake off the thought and began to pace the room. What news from Scotland Yard? Lestrade called this morning. He tells me the authorities are satisfied that the verger's death was accidental. Accidental? Holmes repeated with a dry chuckle. A convenient euphemism. They prefer a fall to a hanging. It preserves the dignity of the church. So be it. The dead man carries his own absolution. He stopped before the window, parting the curtains to look out upon the fog-dimmed street below. You observe, Watson, how quickly London forgets. A crime, a headline, a funeral, and the tide flows on. Yet the bells of St. Ethelreda's will not sound quite the same again. There is memory in metal as well as in men. You speak as if the place were haunted still, I said. Perhaps it is, he answered, and for a moment his face, reflected in the glass, seemed older, almost weary. Haunted not by spirits, but by echoes, echoes of folly, fear, and remorse. Every great city has its unburied past, its invisible cemeteries of guilt. The trick, my dear fellow, is not to dig too deep. I felt silent watching him. There are times when even my closest understanding of the man fails utterly. For all his vaunted reason, Holmes's mind held chambers no logic could unlock, rooms filled with solitude, with half-forgotten music, with those subtle moral shadows that only the very keen or the very lonely perceive. After a pause, he turned with sudden briskness. Tell me, Watson, have you written your account of the affair? Not yet. I thought it too soon. Then write it now, while the scent still clings to your imagination. But do not call it The Bride of the Bell Tower. That title belongs to the sensationalists. Call it The Candle That Would Not Die. It was that, after all, which burned at the heart of the mystery. I promised to do so, though I could not resist smiling at the irony of his suggestion. You know, Holmes, said I, there are times when your modesty is as elaborate as your vanity. He laughed outright. My dear fellow, modesty is the vanity of the self-effacing. But since you insist on accuracy, you may say that the case was solved not by me, but by a candle, a rope, and a foolish man's heart. There came then a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel addressed to Holmes. He broke the seal carelessly, then paused, his expression softening. Inside lay a single white lily, pressed between 2 sheets of paper, and a brief note in a woman's delicate hand, in memory of those who loved wrongly, and of him who sought the truth kindly. Agnes Larkin. Holmes regarded the flower for a long moment. Then very gently he set it upon the mantel beside the vial and the tiny scrap of rope he had kept from the tower. "A curious thing, Watson," he said at last. "A symbol of death. Yet it smells of forgiveness. One could do worse than end a case with that." He took up his violin, tuned a string with the delicate precision of a man aligning his soul to harmony, and began to play. A low, plaintive melody that filled the room with a sense of mournful peace. It rose, trembled, and faded, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the distant tolling of a church bell somewhere beyond the fog. I remember thinking, as I laid down my pen, that it was not the sound of London's ceaseless noise I heard then, but something deeper, a requiem for innocence lost, for love gone astray, and for the strange justice that moves, unseen, in the heart of men. Chapter 8. The Whisper of the Bells. It was in the spring of the following year, when the first faint warmth returned to London's stones, and the horse-chestnuts along the Mall began to put forth their cautious buds, that chance led me once again to the precincts of St. Ethelreda's. I had been visiting a patient in Westminster, and, finding myself with an idle hour before my next call, turned instinctively toward the little close whose name had become, in my memory, synonymous with tragedy and mystery. The church stood much as I had last seen it, though the air seemed lighter now, the stones less burdened. The soot that had long blackened its face had been laboriously scrubbed away, and the leaded windows gleamed in the tentative sunlight. A workman was trimming ivy from the porch, and the sound of his knife against the stone mingled pleasantly with the laughter of a group of children playing nearby. The life of London had reclaimed its corner of peace. As I crossed the gravel path, the bells above stirred softly in a morning breeze. Their murmur was faint, irregular, like a sleeper's sigh, a mere whisper of metal against metal, but it carried to my ear with the same uncanny timbre that had haunted my dreams since that dreadful night. It seemed to me for an instant that the past hovered still within the tower, transparent as the echo of its own voice. I was about to turn away when the door of the vicarage opened and the Reverend Percival Royston stepped out. He recognized me at once, and his kind, lined face brightened with genuine warmth. "Dr. Watson." "My dear sir, what providence brings you back to our quiet corner?" I pressed his hand. "Only nostalgia, perhaps. I thought I might find the old place much changed." "In one sense, yes," said he, "and in another not at all. The bells ring again for weddings and for worship, but I confess I sometimes hear in them a tone that was not there before, a sob beneath the song, if you will. Perhaps that is superstition, though Mr. Holmes himself, I think, would not have dismissed it so lightly." He led me within. The nave, which had seemed so sombre and oppressive during our earlier visits, now glowed with the mellow light of restored glass. The marble of the chancel had been polished. New lilies stood upon the altar, their scent clean and natural. Yet beneath the perfume of the living flowers I got, faintly but unmistakably, a lingering note of that old sweetness, ghostly and thin as memory itself. "You have kept the church well," I said. "I had feared you might close it after all that befell." The vicar shook his head gently. "No, Dr. Watson. To abandon it would have been to yield to the very darkness that misused it. We consecrated the tower anew that Lent, and the first peal of Easter morn was rung by young Stephen Cray himself." "Cray?" I exclaimed. "Then he recovered?" "Entirely. Mr. Holmes was good enough to recommend a physician who specializes in nervous disorders, and through that gentleman's care, and I think through Miss Agnes Larkin's constant nursing, the poor lad has regained both strength and courage. They are to be married next month, with the bells of St. Ethelreda's sounding the procession. A happier ending than most London tales, is it not? I smiled, but there was a curious tightness in my throat. Indeed it is. Holmes will be glad to hear of it. The vicar's eyes softened. Mr. Holmes was here not long ago. He came one evening in the early winter, alone without notice. I found him standing where you stand now, looking up toward the tower. He said little, but before he left he asked me to do him one small favor. What was that? To have the old verger's rope replaced, and the remnants of the former cord preserved in a sealed jar. He said it might teach something some day to someone patient enough to study dust. I had it done, of course. The jar rests in my vestry cupboard. I could not repress a smile. Typical of Holmes. He will catalogue the devil's tale if it bears a fibre of evidence. The vicar chuckled. Perhaps so. Yet he left another gift as well, a little brass plate he asked me to affix to the inside of the tower door. Would you care to see it? He led me to the narrow stair. The climb seemed shorter now, the light less sinister. Halfway up, upon the oak of the door, gleamed a small plaque, newly polished. Upon it, engraved in simple lettering, were these words, "Let the bells speak truth, and the dead rest untroubled. E.C.H." I stood for a moment in silence. Through the Louvre above drifted a thread of wind that stirred the bell ropes gently, so that they gave forth a single clear tone, neither joyous nor mournful, but solemn and calm. It seemed to me that, in that sound, the restless spirit of the place had found its peace. When we descended once more to the nave, I saw Agnes herself arranging flowers at the altar. She turned as we approached, and the colour rose to her cheeks. She had grown lovelier since that night, a quiet, wholesome beauty born of labour and forgiveness. She curtsied modestly. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes told me you might come one day. He said I was to give you something." From a small basket she drew a folded paper, sealed with red wax. "He left it with me before he went away to France last month. He said you would understand when the time came." I broke the seal there and then. Within was a single sheet, written in Holmes's precise hand. "My dear Watson, if ever you revisit St. Ethelreda's, you may hear in its bells a certain interval, an upward third followed by a fall of a fifth. I adjusted their alignment myself on my last visit. Should you chance to hear that chord, know that it is the inversion of a common funeral toll. It speaks, not of death, but of release. A small jest between ourselves, perhaps, but also a lesson that even the saddest of sounds may be turned by a little alteration into a hymn of peace. Your ever faithful friend, S.H." I folded the letter slowly, for my eyes, I confess, were not quite clear. When I looked up, Agnes was smiling through her own tears. "He said you would understand," she whispered. "I do," said I softly. "Better, perhaps, than he knows." That evening, as I walked homeward through the mellow air of spring, the sound of distant bells followed me across the city. I could not tell whether they were truly those of St. Ethelreda's, or only their echo in my heart, but they seemed to blend with every pulse of the streets, the roll of wheels, the cry of vendors, the hum of the great machine of London. Out of all that noise rose a faint, clear harmony, and in it I fancied I heard again the voice of my friend, calm, ironic, compassionate, as if he spoke through those iron throats to the heedless millions below. "There is order even in sorrow, reason even in the ruin of hearts." And as I turned into Baker Street once more, the bells faded into silence behind me, leaving only the whisper of the wind, and the memory of a candle that would not die. Chapter 9. Holmes in Exile. It was in the early summer of that same year, some months after my solitary pilgrimage to St. Ethelreda's, that I received a letter from my friend bearing a French postmark, and written in a hand even more minute and deliberate than usual. The paper was of a thick, foreign sort, faintly scented with lavender, a peculiarity I could not help but smile at, for Holmes had ever maintained that the only proper fragrance for correspondence was tobacco smoke. The letter ran as follows. My dear Watson, I am at present residing in a small fishing village upon the coast of Brittany, a place so remote that the tide itself seems to hesitate before reaching it. The air here is sharp, the people taciturn, and the sea conducts itself with an admirable disregard for human drama. It is, therefore, an ideal environment for the reconstruction of nerves that have too long been tuned to London's dissonance. Do not infer from this that I am ill. My health, physical and mental, remains tolerable, yet I have found, since the affair of the bell tower, a weariness I cannot quite dispel. It is not the fatigue of work, but of spirit, the reaction, perhaps, from seeing too much of that curious intersection between devotion and destruction, which men call faith. You, who possess the tonic of domestic affections, may smile at this confession. But for one who walks, as I do, between reason and its shadow, there are cases that shake the equilibrium more than all the bullets of a Moriarty. The locals here are of a rugged honesty. They regard me with suspicion, as all simple folk do when confronted by solitude in another. I have taken to sea fishing, a pursuit which offers both contemplation and resistance. Qualities lacking, I fear, in the society of men. There is a boy here, Jean-Luc, who reminds me of Wiggins, and who sells me bait with a gravity that would do credit to Scotland Yard. I pay him double, which he receives without expression, thus proving him a philosopher in embryo. Do not trouble yourself about my return. London will draw me back when the tide of restlessness rises again. Until then, believe me, I remain your most affectionate and indebted friend, Sherlock Holmes. The signature, neat and precise, seemed to me to carry a faint melancholy beneath its discipline, and I laid the letter down with a heaviness I could not explain. It was not like Holmes to write of weariness or sentiment. His very confession of them hinted at a deeper wound than he would ever have admitted in person. I showed the letter that evening to my wife, whose gentle understanding has so often been a counterbalance to the sterner moods of my companion. "He is lonely," said she simply when she had read it. "He has lived too long among puzzles and too little among people. You should go to him." "Go to him?" I repeated, startled. "To France?" "Why not? You have leave from the hospital, and his health concerns you. He would not have written so openly had he not wished for company." It was spoken with such quiet conviction that within a week I found myself upon the Channel steamer, bound for Saint-Malo, with a small valise, my medical bag, and the letter in my pocket. The village of Carriers, for so the place was called, proved to be a mere cluster of stone cottages huddled upon a cliff that looked westward toward the grey Atlantic. The sea was ever in one's ears there. Its ceaseless breathing mingled with the cry of gulls and the creak of fishing boats against their moorings. The air smelt of salt, heather, and tar. The people spoke little and worked much. Holmes had taken lodgings in a whitewashed house at the edge of the village, its garden overgrown with fennel and wild roses. I found him seated upon the low wall that overlooked the sea, his chin upon his hand, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. For a long moment he did not see me. When at last he turned, there was genuine pleasure in his eyes, though it passed swiftly beneath the mask of irony that habit had long made second nature. "My dear Watson," he cried, rising to grip my hand with surprising warmth, "you have crossed the Channel to diagnose a case of melancholy, eh? I assure you it is not fatal. Still, your arrival is the best medicine Brittany has yet provided." He looked leaner than when I had last seen him, and the streaks of grey at his temples had grown more pronounced. Yet there was colour in his cheeks, and a clearness in his eyes that bespoke the benefit of the sea air. His violin lay upon the parapet beside him. On the table nearby stood a rough microscope fashioned from a fisherman's glass and bits of brass. "You are experimenting even here," I exclaimed. He smiled. "A mind accustomed to analysis cannot rest entirely. I am engaged at present upon a study of the phosphorescent organisms in seawater. They are the same, I fancy, that produce the curious glow in decaying organic matter. the kind that made our infamous candle so obstinate. Nature repeats her tricks endlessly, though she changes the theatre. We walked together along the cliff path, speaking of small things at first: the weather, the curious dialect of the locals, the quality of Breton tobacco, which he denounced as a conspiracy of damp leaves. Yet as the sun dipped and the western sky burned into gold and violet, his conversation took on a graver tone. "You will laugh at me, Watson," said he at last, "but I have been thinking much of that poor Verger. The mind that can reconcile murder with sanctity is one I cannot wholly fathom, though I have studied it often enough. He did not kill from hatred, you see, but from the conviction that he served the higher good. There lies the peril of the human soul, when reason abdicates in favor of righteousness." "You blame faith, then?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not faith, only the misuse of it. Science, too, may become a creed, and then it breeds its own inquisitors. I have walked perilously near that edge myself. There were moments during our inquiry when I felt less a man than an instrument, cold, detached, devoted to logic at any cost. That, too, is idolatry of a kind." We paused at a bend where the sea stretched wide and lonely beneath us. The light caught his profile, and for a moment I thought how oddly he resembled the tower we had left behind, tall, austere, and solitary against the sky. "You will return to London, Holmes," I ventured. "In time," he said quietly. "The city is an addiction one never wholly cures, but for the present I shall remain where the only mysteries are the tides and the flight of gulls. There is health in such enigmas." He turned to me with a sudden boyish smile. "Besides, I have promised Jean-Luc that I shall perfect for him a chemical means of preserving bait. You see, Watson, even a consulting detective must justify his board." I laughed, and he joined me, a sound I had not heard from him in many months. For a while we stood there, companionably silent, watching the sun sink into the vastness of the western sea. When at last we returned to the little house, he took up his violin once more, and played, not one of the melancholy airs that so often matched his mood, but a clear, simple melody, lifted and sustained by the wind. It was a Breton folk tune, I believe, yet in its cadences I thought I heard, faint and far, the echo of another music, the tolling of the bells of St. Ethelreda's, purified now of sorrow, ringing somewhere beyond the horizon. The following morning I left him there, standing upon the cliff, his gaze fixed once more upon the sea. The wind tugged at his coat, and the salt spray gleamed upon his hair like frost. "Write to me," I said as we clasped hands. "London is not London without you." He smiled that rare inward smile of his. "London will manage, my dear Watson. It always does. But should its shadows grow too thick, you know where to find me." And so I left him, the most singular, the most human, and the most inhuman man I have ever known, standing alone between the land and the sea, a solitary sentinel watching the eternal mystery of the world. Chapter E. The Case of the Crimson Tide. It was nearly 6 weeks after my return to London when I received the telegram that would summon me back into the orbit of my remarkable friend. It was brief, characteristic of Foy. Holmes in its economy, yet freighted with an urgency that could not be mistaken. "Watson, imperative you come at once. Bring medical bag and revolver. A matter of life, death, and color." Holmes. Color. Even in the chill of that late summer morning, the word seemed to glow upon the page. I knew Holmes too well to mistake metaphor for flourish. If he invoked color, it was because the very hue of the world had turned itself to riddle. By the next tide, I was aboard the packet steamer bound for St. Malo. The crossing was rough, the sea a heaving field of grey, but the thought of Holmes's summons quickened my spirit more than the salt wind. I landed in Brittany near nightfall, and before dawn of the following day I was descending once more into the village of Keris, that cluster of stone cottages crouched beneath its eternal wind. The path led me down to the harbor, where boats rocked uneasily at their moorings. To my surprise, the air was thick with an odor of iron, sharp and unsettling, as though some vast wound had opened upon the sea. And then I saw why. The waters of the bay were red, not merely tinged, but deep crimson, spreading from the shore outward like a stain. The fishermen, grouped in knots along the quay, crossed themselves as they watched. Nets hung idle. Gulls circled and screamed above the blood-dark waves. "C'est la mer qui saigne," muttered one old man as I passed. "The sea that bleeds." Holmes awaited me upon the cliff path, his tall figure dark against the reddened tide. His face, usually so composed, was drawn with fatigue and something like fascination. "You are prompt as ever, my dear Watson," he said, gripping my hand. "Behold the most vivid crime scene on earth." "Good heavens! What is it? Pollution?" He shook his head. "The local authorities say a natural phenomenon. I am less inclined to accept their simplicity. The tide turned crimson yesterday at dawn, and has remained so since. Yet the discoloration is confined to this single inlet, as sharply defined as if drawn by a chemist's pipette." We walked together down toward the shore. The color was uncanny, neither the dull brown of mud nor the purple of seaweed, but a rich liquid scarlet that shimmered faintly where the waves lapped the stones. The smell of iron grew stronger, mingled with the faint reek of decay. Holmes knelt, dipped a glass vial into the surf, and held it to the light. The water gleamed like diluted blood. "I have already tested it," he said. "No trace of actual hemoglobin. The hue is caused by an organic pigment of rare intensity. I have found microscopic spores, something akin to Trichodesmium erythraeum, the so-called Red Sea bloom. Yet this concentration, confined to one bay, argues not chance, but design." "Design? You mean?" "I mean that someone has introduced it, and at great labor." I looked about us. The little harbor was deserted, even the boldest. Sailors had drawn their boats upon the shingle and retreated inland. Over all hung that oppressive stillness that follows superstition, as though the sea itself listened. Holmes straightened, his grey eyes alight. "There has been death here, Watson. The sea hides it, but she whispers to those who have learned her language." We made our way to his lodgings, where upon a rough wooden table he had arranged a series of glass dishes, a microscope, and a clutter of small bottles labelled in his precise hand. A map of the coast lay spread beside them, dotted with red ink. "The phenomenon," he explained, "extends from this headland to the old breakwater. Note that the coloration follows no current pattern, but rather radiates from a single point, the mouth of the Cavanic Cave, where the tides meet." He pointed to a narrow inlet drawn upon the map. "The villagers call it La Grotte du Silence. They claim no one who enters at low tide returns. Nonsense, of course, yet myths are often the camouflage of fact." He took a small phial from his pocket and handed it to me. Within floated a fragment of dark fabric, saturated and heavy. "This was brought up by a fisherman's net an hour before the tide turned. Silk, of fine quality, likely from a woman's gown, stained with the same crimson pigment." "You suspect murder?" I said quietly. "I suspect intent," Holmes replied. "Murder is but the visible tip of that particular iceberg." We set out together toward the Cavanic Cave that afternoon. The path wound steeply down the cliffs, and the roar of the surf grew louder with each step. Clouds massed overhead, and the red sheen of the tide reflected upon them so that sea and sky alike seemed aflame. The mouth of the cave yawned at the base of a jagged promontory, a black aperture framed by crimson water. Holmes paused, his keen eyes scanning the rocks. "Observe the footprints, Watson. 2 distinct sets, one large, the other small, feminine, both leading inward, none returning." We entered cautiously, lanterns raised. The passage was narrow and damp, the walls encrusted with salt crystals that glittered like frost. After some 20 yards, the tunnel widened into a chamber where the air hung heavy with a strange, sweet odor, not of lilies this time, but of something darker, resinous and faintly metallic. Holmes knelt, touching the floor. "Oil," he murmured. "Lantern oil mixed with tar. And here," he indicated the wall, "a recent chisel mark. Someone has been quarrying stone." "What possible purpose?" I began, when a sudden exclamation from Holmes cut me short. He had turned his light upon the far side of the chamber, where the rock dipped into a small, still pool. Floating there, half submerged, was a shape that froze the blood in my veins. It was the body of a woman. She was dressed in dark silk, her hair unbound and drifting like seaweed in the sluggish water. The red tide had stained her skin to a ghastly pallor, as though she had been bathed in wine. Holmes crouched beside her, his expression grave but composed. "There is no wound," he said quietly. "A death by suffocation, I think. The lungs filled with the pigment-laden water. But see here." He lifted her left hand gently. No wedding ring, though the skin bears its mark, and upon the wrist faint traces of rope. He rose and turned to me. "The sea, Watson, has once more received an offering. But this time it is not the bride who haunts the bells. It is the widow who haunts the tide." The investigation that followed would prove to be among the strangest of our shared adventures, a mystery in which science and superstition, revenge and remorse, were woven together like the shifting colors of that unnatural sea. For the moment, however, Holmes was silent. As we emerged from the cave, the first drops of rain began to fall, turning the crimson tide to a deeper, more dreadful hue. Holmes looked back toward the dark entrance and then out to the horizon, where the dying light struck the water into fire. "It begins again, Watson," he murmured. "Another chord in the same infernal symphony. London's shadows have followed me across the channel." I said nothing. The wind tore at our coats, and the sea roared below, crimson and wild. And in that roaring I fancied I heard, faint and far, the echo of the bells of St. Ethelreda's, tolling once more for a mystery that had crossed from the heart of England to the edge of the world. Chapter the 5th. The Widow of the Red Sea. The storm that night was one of those tempests that seem to break upon the world with moral purpose. Wind howled through the gorse and flung spindrift against the shutters of Holmes's cottage. The sea, still stained by its uncanny redness, raged like a living thing. I remember that the little lamp upon Holmes's work table trembled with every gust, and its wavering flame lent a spectral pallor to the dead woman's face, which lay covered by a rough fisher's shroud upon the trestle beside us. Holmes bent over her in silence. His instruments were laid out with the precision of a surgeon, yet there was a reverence in his touch that bespoke not science, but respect. He lifted the linen only far enough to examine the features. A young woman, perhaps 25, whose beauty had not been erased by death, but merely stilled. "Watson," said he, "you observe the faint bluish mark about the nostrils and lips. It is the signature of an asphyxiant. But not water alone. There is an additive here, something introduced." He took from his case a small bottle and held it beneath my nose. It emitted a sweet, faintly cloying odor that stirred an unpleasant recognition. "Ether?" I suggested. "Not quite. Ether mingled with camphor, an old embalmer's trick. The pigment in the water is mixed with this volatile essence which would render a confined space deadly. Our unfortunate lady was drowned, yes, but only after she had lost consciousness." "You mean she was murdered deliberately?" "I mean," said Holmes gravely, "that she was entombed in ritual." He gestured toward a small object he had laid aside, a length of silk cord knotted in an elaborate loop. "This, Watson, is no sailor's knot, nor is it Breton. It is what antiquaries call a marriage knot, used in certain obscure funerary customs of the Breton coast. Widows, they say, tie such cords around votive offerings cast into the sea, to wed their grief to the waves. But here the offering was not a token. It was herself." I stared at him in horror. "You cannot mean she took her own life?" Holmes shook his head slowly. If so, she had assistance. The knot was tied at her back. The cord bears no strain of self-binding. And see, the wrists, faintly bruised as though restrained. No, Watson, she was made a bride of the sea, but not by her own will. He turned to his writing case and drew forth the silk scrap we had found earlier that day, the fragment from her gown. From its inner seam he extracted a narrow strip of paper, folded and sealed with wax. He broke it carefully, revealing a few lines written in a delicate feminine hand. For the sin that cannot be washed, I return to the sea. Tell him it was not love, but penance. There was no signature. Holmes read it twice, then laid it upon the table and stood very still, his eyes fixed upon the flame of the lamp. Tell him, he repeated, a pronoun with an ocean for antecedent. Watson, we must find the him before the tide buries all trace. At dawn we descended once more to the harbour. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and sharp, but the sea remained red. The fishermen watched us from a wary distance. One, an elderly Breton with a face carved like oak, raised his cap as we approached. "Monsieur Holmes?" he said, for the name by now was on every tongue. "The dead woman. You have seen her?" "I have," Holmes replied in fluent French. "You knew her." The man crossed himself. "She was called Madame d'Aubigny, the English widow. Came here 6 months ago, lived alone in the house above the cliffs. Spoke little, walked much, always at dusk. Some said she waited for someone from the sea." Holmes's eyes kindled. "From the sea? A sailor?" The old man shrugged. "Who can say? There was a gentleman who came sometimes from Saint-Malo. Tall, proud, a soldier perhaps. But of late he came no more." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Watson, we returned to Saint-Malo. It was late afternoon when we reached that ancient walled city, its granite ramparts gleaming in the pale sun. Holmes moved through its narrow streets like a bloodhound upon a trail, asking brief, incisive questions in his impeccable French, until at last we found ourselves before a modest town-house near the harbour. The name upon the bell plate read Capitaine Armand Dare. "Dare!" I exclaimed. "Can it be?" "Evidently a relation," said Holmes, his eyes narrowing. "Let us see what species of relation." The door was opened by a man in naval uniform, his beard streaked with grey, but his bearing unmistakably that of the soldier's caste. He started when Holmes pronounced the name of Madame d'Aubigny, then stood aside wordlessly and motioned us in. The interior bore that air of disciplined neglect, which marks the home of a man haunted by memory. Upon the mantel stood a single photograph, that of a young woman, smiling faintly, dressed in white. The same face, though younger and untroubled, lay now under a fisherman's shroud in Queyrais. "She was my brother's wife," said the captain at last. "Lionel Dare. He married her after returning from India. She was widowed. By his death at St. Ethelreda's," Holmes finished quietly. The man's eyes widened. "Then you know." "I was there." The captain sank into a chair, his composure crumbling. "He wrote to her from England before his disgrace. She followed him here after the inquiry, believing him innocent. I begged her to forget, but she said she must cleanse his name. She spoke often of the bells, and of some woman who haunted them. Agnes Larkin," I murmured. "She never reached her. I think she found instead another sort of priest, an old recluse who lives by the Cavannic headland, half mystic, half madman. He filled her head with tales of redemption through the sea. She believed she could atone for Lionel's sin, or for her own, whatever it was, by surrendering herself to the tide. I went to reason with her, but she forbade me the house. When the sea turned red—" He broke off, covering his face with his hands. I knew. Holmes's expression had hardened to that diamond focus which signified certainty. "This recluse, his name? Morin. A failed chemist once in Paris. He lives in a hut above the cave. Then our crimson tide has its source. We found Morin that same evening. His dwelling stood upon the edge of the cliff, a tangle of driftwood and stone, surrounded by strange contrivances, glass retorts, copper vessels, and a labyrinth of pipes through which the wind moaned like an organ. The man himself was tall and cadaverous, his hair long and white, his eyes bright with feverish intelligence. He received us with a thin smile. "You come about the sea, eh? Beautiful, is it not? A miracle of my own devising." "Indeed," said Holmes coldly, "a miracle purchased with a woman's life." Moran's smile did not falter. "She sought purification. I merely provided the means. The red bloom, my creation, a symbiosis of algae and reagent. It feeds upon decay and spreads light from death. She wished the sea to bear her confession. I made it visible. The color of sin, she said, and of redemption. You assisted her suicide, I said sharply. I assisted her transformation, he retorted. She entered the sea as mortal. She remains now as element. Each wave that breaks upon the shore is her absolution. Holmes regarded him with a chill fascination. And you mixed your pigment with ether to hasten her deliverance. Morand inclined his head. It was merciful. She felt nothing. The sea received her gently. There was silence for a long moment, broken only by the wind through the pipes. Then Holmes said softly, "Mercy that kills is still murder." He stepped forward suddenly, seizing the man's wrist. "Your hands, Morand. They bear the same violet stain I have seen before. Lenoir's fixative. You were once his supplier in Paris. You used his formula to stain the tide, as Kettle used it to poison the air. It seems, Watson, that evil travels best by scent." Morand laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Evil. I have given the world a color it has never known. The sea itself testifies." Holmes released him. "The sea testifies yet, ye, and it shall testify at your trial." The French gendarmes, summoned by Holmes's prior telegram, arrived before dawn to take the mad chemist into custody. As they led him away, he turned once toward the blood-red surf and whispered something in Breton that I did not understand. But Holmes did, for I saw him start, then bow his head as though in reluctant respect. "What did he say?" I asked as we watched the man vanish into the mist. Holmes's voice was low. He said, "She is cleansed." The next tide came in pale and green, washing away the last traces of crimson. The fishermen crossed themselves and went back to their nets. Life resumed its patient rhythm, as if the sea, having accepted its offering, was content to forget. That night Holmes stood long upon the cliff, the wind tugging at his coat. "Two widows, Watson," he said at last. "One who died for love, one who killed for it. Between them a man who mistook sanctity for possession, and another who mistook atonement for death. There is a pattern here that repeats itself, from London's tower to Brittany's tide." He turned, his eyes catching the last light of the sinking moon. "Do you not see, Watson? Every human soul is a bell, and when struck by passion or remorse, it tolls the same note, whether in Westminster or the wildest sea. The waves below whispered their assent, and the wind carried their murmur out into the endless dark." Chapter 2. The Color That Stayed. The events that followed the arrest of the chemist Morand belong in truth more to the domain of melancholy reflection than to the annals of crime. The gendarmes conveyed their prisoner to Saint-Malo, where after a brief examination he was declared to be of unsound mind, and committed to the asylum at Rennes. The Breton newspapers spoke of him as le savant fou de Sicile, la mer rouge, the mad scientist of the Red Sea, and within a fortnight the tide of gossip had turned to other matters. Yet for Holmes, the case was not finished. He remained in Querriez, restless and withdrawn, as though the strange red tide had left its sediment within his mind. Day after day I found him upon the cliff at dawn, staring seaward through his glass, his notebook filled with observations on currents, wind, and the gradual fading of the stain. When at last I ventured to urge him to return to London, he merely shook his head. "Not yet, Watson," said he. "There is a residue I do not understand. The sea, you see, has a better memory than men. It forgets nothing. I must know whether it forgives. At the time I took this for one of those half-mystical moods to which he was occasionally prone after prolonged mental strain. Yet in the days that followed, I came to see that his meaning was more literal than I had imagined. The red of the water, though greatly diminished, did not entirely vanish. Even after Morin's apparatus had been dismantled and every flask of his pigment destroyed, there remained along the tide line a faint blush that no current washed away. It clung to the rocks in streaks, as though the sea herself had taken color from the crime. Holmes collected sample after sample, examining them under his improvised microscope with an attention bordering on obsession. One morning he beckoned me to his table with a cry of triumph. "Look, Watson, do you perceive those minute globules?" Through the lens I saw tiny spheres, luminous as garnet, pulsing faintly with an inner light. "Living matter," said Holmes. "Morin's reagent was meant to perish with the tide, but the organism he employed has adapted itself to the salt. It breeds still, though more slowly. He set out to make the sea a witness to sin, and he has succeeded beyond his intent. The witness will not die. Then the color will remain. For generations, perhaps," he murmured, "a perpetual confession written upon the shore. What man has joined, nature has not put asunder." He sat back, the old spark of analytic triumph dying from his eyes as swiftly as it had flared. "And yet, Watson, I cannot quite rejoice in this discovery. There is something monstrous in it, this idea of a guilt that propagates itself like life." That evening we walked once more along the cliffs. The wind was low and steady, the sea calm save for the faint red shimmer that followed the retreating wave. The setting sun struck it into splendor, so that for one brief hour the whole bay blazed crimson and gold. "Beautiful," I said involuntarily. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the horizon. "Yes, terribly beautiful. There lies the eternal irony, my dear fellow. Man sins through passion, and nature, indifferent, translates his transgression into loveliness." We stood for a long while without speaking. The tide whispered below us, and far out, on the water, a single fishing boat drifted like a shadow on a flame. At last Holmes spoke again, very quietly. "You recall what Morin said, that she was cleansed. I think he spoke more truly than he knew. The sea has taken her into its economy, absorbed her as it absorbs all things, and has turned even her death into color. Perhaps, in that sense, she is forgiven." There was something in his tone that stirred me deeply, the note of a man reasoning not with me but with himself. "Holmes," I said, "you have seen much evil, and reasoned it out as another man might unravel a cipher, but you cannot carry the world's grief upon your shoulders." He smiled faintly. "Do not fear for me, Watson. My shoulders are narrower than you think. But I have learned one truth from this case which I would not willingly forget, that the smallest act of man, whether of love or of folly, may stain the great sea of life more deeply than he dreams. The color fades, yes, but it never quite goes." He stooped and lifted a small stone from the sand, its underside still glistening faintly red. Turning it in his hand, he added, "We all leave traces, my dear fellow, even those who seek only to observe." The next morning Holmes packed his few belongings with brisk precision. "You are right, Watson," said he, as though the decision had been mine. "It is time we returned to Baker Street. The tides will do their own housekeeping now." We left Currier's at dawn. The villagers watched us depart in silence, their dark eyes following Holmes with a mixture of awe and gratitude. At the crest of the hill he paused, looked back once at the shining sea, and raised his hand as if in farewell. "The stain will fade," he said softly, "but some part of it will remain in my mind, a reminder that deduction may explain the world, but cannot cleanse it." I said nothing. The gulls wheeled above us, crying their wild benediction, and the wind carried from far below a low, harmonious murmur, the whisper of waves upon reddened sand. When, some weeks later, we were once more installed at Baker Street, I noticed that Holmes had placed upon the mantel a small glass phial filled with a trace of that crimson water. It stood there among his curiosities, a quiet token of a case too grave for trophies. One evening, as the firelight caught it, I saw him glance at it with a curious expression, half melancholy, half satisfaction. "Still read," he observed. "Even in London's ear it keeps its tint. The sea remembers, Watson. It always does." And he took up his violin, drawing from it a slow, minor melody that seemed to blend with the city's distant murmur, the measured rhythm of a man who, having peered once more into the abyss, finds in music the only answer that does not lie. The crimson gleam upon the mantel flickered like a candle in the draught, and for a moment the room seemed filled with the light of some vast unseen tide, a tide that rolled not through the channel, but through the uncharted depths of the human heart. Chapter 13. The music of the abyss. The months that followed our return from Brittany were among the strangest I ever spent at Baker Street. Holmes resumed his professional practice, yet there lingered about him a reserve I had not seen since those bleak days after the Reichenbach tragedy. He spoke little of our Breton adventure, but I observed that he avoided mention of the sea altogether, and more than once I found him standing motionless before the mantel, gazing into that small vial of crimson water, as though it were an oracle of things better left unsaid. The London autumn drew in, damp, drab, and grey, and yet Holmes, who once thrived in the city's restless pulse, seemed strangely untouched by it. He refused several lucrative cases, declining them with an absent air. Music had become his sole passion, but it was not the sharp, exhilarating improvisation of former days. His bow now drew from the violin tones of such haunting beauty that even the street noises outside seemed to pause in deference. It was one evening in late November when I ventured to speak what had long been on my mind. "You have not been yourself, Holmes," said I. "This crimson tide has left you haunted." He did not look up, but the ghost of a smile passed over his features. "Haunted, perhaps. But by what, Watson? By guilt? By curiosity? Or by that unanswerable question, why beauty should arise out of horror?" He drew the bow across the strings again. The note that issued was unlike anything I had ever heard, a low throbbing vibration that seemed not to belong to the instrument but to the very air. It was as if the city itself were sighing through his hands. "Listen," he said softly. "Do you hear it? The overtone beneath the note?" I listened, and indeed there was a faint harmonic, distant, wavering, like the hum of wind across a glass. "That," said he, "is the abyss, the echo that remains when the melody is gone. I have sought it in every sound since Brittany. It is the same frequency, the same resonance as the toll of the bells at St. Ethelreda's, the same vibration that once set the crimson tide aflame. It is, I am convinced, the fundamental note of remorse." I could not repress a shiver. "You speak as though emotion could be measured." "Emotion is vibration," he returned quietly. "Fear, grief, love, each has its own frequency. Why should remorse not have one also? It seems to me that every act of conscience sends its ripple through creation, as a bell through air or a drop through water. The chemist stains the sea, the verger poisons the air, and yet each leaves behind the same echo, an appeal for harmony." He laid down the violin and crossed to the window. London lay before us, blurred by fog, the lamps glimmering like embers in a dying hearth. "Do you know, Watson," he said, "what struck me most about Morin's creation? It was not the redness of it, nor its horror, but its music. Under the microscope, each living sphere pulsed rhythmically, a billion tiny heartbeats in perfect unison. It was as though the sea had found its own hymn of repentance. I could hear it, faint, but distinct, when I held the dish to my ear." He turned to me suddenly. "I have wondered since whether guilt itself might be but a form of resonance, Whether when man sins he jars the harmony of the universe, and the echo of that discord is what we call conscience. Holmes, I said quietly, you are wandering upon dangerous ground. You risk losing yourself in speculation no science can chart. He smiled faintly. Possibly, but I find it curiously comforting, this notion that even remorse obeys law. That pain, too, has its physics. For some minutes neither of us spoke. The wind outside moaned softly through the chimney, carrying with it the faint toll of a distant church bell. Holmes lifted his head. "Do you hear it, Watson? St. Paul's, perhaps, or St. Mary-le-Beau, but it might just as well be St. Ethelreda's. The note is the same." He returned to his chair, took up the violin once more, and began to play. At first the slow lament I had come to associate with his reflective moods, but gradually it changed, the melody rising, weaving itself into something luminous, almost exultant. The sound filled the room like light. "Good heavens, Holmes," I whispered. "That is beautiful." He smiled without opening his eyes. "Do you recognize it?" I listened more intently, and then I knew. It was the old chime he had altered at St. Ethelreda's, that upward third, the fall of a fifth. Transposed now to strings, it had lost its solemnity and become a kind of benediction. He ceased abruptly and let the bow fall to his side. "You see, Watson, even remorse can be resolved into grace given the right inversion. The same interval that once mourned the dead may, turned upon itself, praise the living. The abyss and the hymn are but reflections of one another." He leaned back, eyes half closed, and in the firelight I thought I saw the shadow of that crimson phial reflected upon his face, like the last light of a sunset upon calm water. "Perhaps that is what all deduction truly seeks," he murmured. "Not merely truth, but harmony, the adjustment of discordant facts until the world once again rings true." There was a long silence. The clock ticked softly. The fog pressed its cold fingers against the panes. Then Holmes, with a faint, almost playful smile, added, "I begin to suspect, my dear Watson, that the universe is not a problem to be solved, but a melody to be heard. And we, you with your pen, I with my violin, are merely instruments that sound for a while, and then fall silent." He drew the bow one final time, a whisper of a note that seemed to fade into infinity. When it was gone, the hush that followed was more profound than any music. I sat without speaking, scarcely daring to move, until the fire sank to ash and the lamplight flickered low. It seemed to me that the great detective had in that moment ceased to reason and begun to understand. And as the bell of St. Mary's struck midnight, the echo that lingered in the air was not sorrow nor triumph, but something between the two, the calm, eternal note of comprehension. Chapter 14. The Last Deduction. It was in the first week of February, a season of dreary skies and wind that seemed to gnaw the very bones of London, that Holmes concluded what he called, with that ironic gravity of his, the last deduction of the affair. For several days he had been in one of those moods of intense abstraction that rendered him half companion, half enigma. His violin stood silent in its corner. The crimson vial upon the mantel remained unstirred. He took no visitors, refused the morning post, and even my best attempts at conversation fell upon him like rain upon granite. At last, one evening, as I sat before the fire pretending to read, he rose suddenly from his chair and said with a kind of quiet decision, "Watson, I have been wrong." It was so unlike him that I laid down my book in astonishment. "Wrong, Holmes? About what?" He turned toward the firelight, his lean face half in shadow, half in gold. "About the nature of my work, and of myself. I have always held that the detective's art is an exact science, a pure application of reason to the disorder of human folly. Yet the Bride of the Bell Tower and the Crimson Tide have shown me otherwise. They have taught me that beneath all crime, beneath all suffering, there beats a rhythm, not of logic, but of life itself. And life, my dear Watson, is not an equation, but a harmony disturbed. He began to pace the rug, his hands clasped behind him, his voice low and meditative. I thought once that my task was to extinguish evil, to trace every dark thread back to its root and tear it out by the hand of reason. But I see now that evil, like pain, cannot be excised. It must be understood or it multiplies. Morin sought to cleanse a soul by poison, Kettle to sanctify love by murder. Both failed because they mistook order for truth. I too have done so. I have pursued perfection of logic when I should have sought compassion of mind. He stopped before the mantel, gazing at the little vial where the crimson liquid glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Do you remember, Watson, how I said the sea forgets nothing? Perhaps it does not forgive either. But man— He turned, and for once his voice softened into something almost tender. Man may forgive if he can only learn to see the pattern of another's ruin in his own reflection. I rose, moved beyond words. Never had I heard him speak thus. My dear Holmes, I murmured, you have done more for humanity than any priest or philosopher. He smiled faintly. But they would call my theology unsound and my metaphysics sentimental. Yet perhaps both priest and detective serve the same altar, Watson, the altar of meaning. One seeks it in scripture, the other in evidence. Each asks the same question. Why do men err, and can the error be redeemed? He took the vial delicately in his hand and held it toward the fire. The light passed through it, casting a ruby glow upon his face and the ceiling above. This, he said, is the color of all our stories, the hue of life and death, of love and guilt. It is the same in the blood of the sinner and the saint. The chemist might call it iron oxide, the poet passion, the theologian sacrifice. But it is, in the end, the same substance, the same tide. He replaced it gently and resumed his chair. If I were to name the law that governs all cases, all crimes, it would not be logic, but consequence. Nothing done is ever truly lost. Kettle's perfume, Morin's pigment, both were conceived to vanish, yet both endured. The atoms of their misdeeds entered the air and sea. Perhaps so do ours, in subtler form. Every choice, every cruelty, every act of pity leaves its vibration in the ether. He smiled again, faintly. And you, my dear fellow, have been my conscience through it all. Where I sought proof, you sought mercy. You have reminded me that to solve a mystery is not to silence it. I confess the words moved me more deeply than I can express. You give me more credit than I deserve, I said. But if I have done anything, it was only to see the man behind the mind. For a moment we sat without speaking. Outside, the wind moaned in the chimney like the sighing of a distant tide. Then Holmes said softly, There are times, Watson, when I think the world itself is but one vast case, unsolved, unending, and beautiful, every human soul a clue, every act a trace upon the fabric. The detective and the doctor are merely readers of that record. He rose then, took up his violin, and tuned it slowly. Let us close the ledger, my friend. One cannot reason forever. The melody that followed was unlike any I had ever heard. It began with the somber tolling motif of the Westminster bells, that low, descending fifth we had heard echoing through the fog on so many nights. Then, gradually, it rose into the interval he had devised at St. Ethelreda's, the upward third, the gentle fall, sorrow turned into peace. The music filled the room, rippling like water, until it seemed that the crimson light of the vial upon the mantel had spread to every shadow of the flat. At length he let the final note fade into silence. You see, Watson, he said quietly, there are no unsolved cases, only unfinished symphonies. He set the violin aside, drew his chair nearer to the fire, and for once seemed entirely at rest. I watched him in that tranquil pose. The keen eyes softened, the long fingers relaxed upon the arm of the chair, and felt that I was looking upon the true Holmes at last, stripped of enigma, at peace with both the world and himself. The clock struck midnight, the embers glowed faintly. Outside the fog thickened until London seemed to vanish into its own breath. But within that small circle of warmth and lamplight, there was a serenity I have never known elsewhere, the stillness of a man who had reached the end not of reason, but of understanding. It was the last evening I would ever hear him play. When I rose to leave, he merely said, "Good night, Watson, and thank you for listening." That perhaps was his truest farewell. And thus ended what I have come to call the twofold mystery of my friend Sherlock Holmes, beginning in the tower where a false bride was slain, and closing by the crimson sea where a true widow was redeemed. Both, in their own tragic way, revealed to him what deduction alone could never teach, that the world's most intricate pattern is not drawn in ink or blood, but in forgiveness. Sometimes, in quiet hours, when the wind carries the distant tolling of church bells across the city, I think I hear again that interval he created, sorrow resolving into peace. And I know that somewhere beyond the reach of logic, the master detective still listens for the harmony of all things. Chapter 15. The Violet Envelope. It was in the autumn of 1910, many years after the case of the Crimson Tide had been laid to rest, that I received quite unexpectedly the last communication I was ever to have from Sherlock Holmes. By then I was an old man in practice at Kensington, my hair silvered, my steps slower, and my pen inclined more to reminiscence than record. Holmes had long withdrawn from London life, as the world knows, to that curious hermitage of his upon the Sussex Downs, where he occupied himself with his bees and his thoughts in equal measure. I had visited him there twice, each time finding him leaner, browner, and quieter, though never diminished. After my dear Mary's death, correspondence between us had grown infrequent, yet always affectionate. It was therefore with no small pang of surprise that I saw, one misty morning, the handwriting I knew so well, slanted, precise, and faintly ascetic, upon an envelope of pale violet paper, sealed with wax the colour of dried blood. The postmark read simply, Eastbourne. I confess my hand trembled slightly as I broke the seal. My dear Watson, if this letter reaches you, it will mean that the final page of my own record is turning, and that the pen with which I have written so many of the world's smaller puzzles has found at last its larger silence. You will forgive, I hope, an old man his attempt to put his house in order, not for posterity, which has never much interested me, but for friendship, which always has. Do you recall the little vial of crimson water upon the mantel in Baker Street? You may remember that I once said the sea forgets nothing. I have since come to see that I was wrong once more, blessedly wrong, for even seas, given time, are healed by their own tides. The vial I kept these many years has faded to palest rose. Nature, it seems, practices forgiveness as a slow alchemy. I have found here, among my bees, a quiet that resembles understanding. The hive is an ordered world, relentless, industrious, yet curiously merciful. No creature there questions the necessity of its labor. Each accepts consequence as law. Watching them, I perceive that the logic of life is circular, not linear, a harmony, not an equation. Every sting, every sweetness has its echo in the other. You once said that I sought truth as a priest seeks God. Perhaps so. But now in these last seasons, I have come to think that truth and mercy are but two wings of the same bird. Logic explains the flight, but love alone lets it rise. Do not be sorrowful when you hear that my health declines. The bees will miss me less than you, and even you must not grieve. I have solved the case that includes all others, the case of the human heart, and I am content to leave the verdict unspoken. I enclose something which belongs to you more than to me, the melody you once heard me play on that foggy night in Baker Street, the inversion of the bells. I have written it down at last. You will find that, played slowly, it resolves into a plain hymn, simple, inevitable, and kind. Play it, my dear fellow, when you need to remember that there was once order in the world and friendship in its midst, Give my affectionate greetings to those who yet remember the old rooms, the fog, and the two fools who thought they could tidy chaos with deduction. And believe me always, in life and beyond it, your devoted friend, Sherlock Holmes. A thin sheet of music accompanied the letter. 4 staves, each line bearing the fine, exact handwriting of a man who measured emotion in half-tones. The opening bars were indeed familiar, the old Westminster chime transposed and turned upon itself. But as I sat at my piano and played, the melody unfolded into something of such gentleness that my eyes blurred upon the keys. It was not the austere intellect of Holmes that spoke through those notes, but the tender heart he had always denied possessing. When the final chord faded, I thought I heard, from somewhere far beyond the London roofs, the faint tolling of a bell, not mournful, but serene. I journeyed to Sussex some days later, only to find that he had already gone. The housekeeper told me he had taken his bees to the meadow one bright morning, and had not returned. Yet they found him at twilight, seated against the old stone wall overlooking the downs, his hat beside him, his violin across his knees, the bow loosely clasped in one hand. The evening light had caught the glass of the vial he kept upon the parapet, turning its pale rose hue into gold. He looked, said the woman softly, as if he were listening. They buried him there, beneath a hawthorn tree alive with bees, within sound of the sea he had once sworn could not forget. The villagers placed upon his grave a small bronze plaque of their own making. It bore no title, only 3 words: The Logic of Mercy. Years have passed since then. I grow old, and the world has changed beyond the shape we knew. Yet sometimes, when London's fog drifts low and the bells of Westminster murmur through the night, I take down that faded sheet of music and play it once more. It is a simple tune, a little upward third, a falling fifth, but to me it carries the whole story of my friend, his precision, his sorrow, his courage, and that hard-won tenderness he never confessed in life. When the final note fades into the hush, I always think I hear another violin answering faintly, somewhere beyond the walls, as if across the great silence, the master detective had found at last the harmony he sought. And the candle upon my desk, trembling though no draught stirs, burns just a little brighter. Chapter 15. The Beekeeper's Hymn. It was in the late summer of 1912, 2 years to the month after Holmes's passing, that I made my final pilgrimage to Sussex. The train bore me through a countryside heavy with ripened grain, and luminous with that mellow gold which belongs only to an English August. I had been unwell that spring, and my physician urged sea air and quiet. Yet I knew, even as I packed my case, that I sought neither. What drew me was not health, but memory. The small station lay drowsing beneath the downs when I arrived. Beyond it stretched the path I knew by heart, winding between hawthorn hedges toward the low farmhouse that had once been his retreat. The bees met me first, clouds of them, humming in that steady, sunlit chorus which is both work and worship. Their note filled the air, so constant and pure that for a moment I fancied it was a kind of music, and that if I listened aright, I might hear in it the echo of a violin. The house itself was little changed. The shutters were drawn back, the garden thick with lavender and thyme. The caretaker, a kindly old fellow who remembered the great gentleman who spoke to the bees as if they were people, greeted me with rustic courtesy and led me by a narrow path to the meadow behind the orchard. "There, sir," said he, pointing with his stick, "that's where we laid him. The hives have stayed close to him ever since. Never a swarm leaves that corner of the field." I thanked him and went on alone. The grave lay beneath a hawthorn tree that scattered its white petals upon the grass like slow snow. A simple headstone bore the inscription I already knew: Sherlock Holmes, The Logic of Mercy. There was no date, only that phrase, chosen, I think, by the villagers, though I could almost hear Holmes himself approving its austere paradox. I stood there a long while in silence, watching, The bees drift in and out of the blossoms. Their low hymn filled the air, so measured, so mathematical, that I could almost believe the creatures had inherited something of his spirit. Indeed, I found myself smiling at the fancy. Holmes transmuted into 1,000 golden messengers, each keeping perfect order, each gathering sweetness from the world's small sorrows. From my coat I drew the thin yellowed sheet of music he had left me, the melody he had called the inversion of the bells. I spread it upon the rough stone of the headstone and traced the familiar notes with my finger. Then very softly I began to hum. At the first phrase, the bees nearest the hives rose in a gentle cloud, circling in the sunlight as though stirred by some unseen conductor. Their humming deepened, vibrating in perfect pitch with my voice. The sound swelled, rose, and fell in that same interval, the upward third, the long descending fifth, until it seemed that the whole field was singing. It was then I remembered a sentence from his last letter. Logic explains the flight, but love alone lets it rise. For the first time in many years I felt something of that love which had lain unspoken between us, an affection not bound by habit or admiration, but by a shared search for meaning amid the world's enigmas. The sun dipped slowly toward the sea, turning the hives to gold. The bees settled one by one, their hymn softening into silence. I folded the music carefully, placed it within my breast pocket, and said aloud, "Goodbye, my friend." A wind came down from the hill, rustling the hawthorn leaves. The air filled for an instant with a faint harmonic vibration, so faint that I might have imagined it. But I knew that sound. It was the same pure note Holmes had once drawn from his violin when reason yielded to peace. That evening I returned to the village inn. The landlady, seeing the direction from which I came, nodded gravely. "You've been to him, then?" she said. "Strange thing, sir. Every Sunday near sunset those bees take to the air and hum as though they're singing. My husband says it's just the weather, but I think they know." I smiled. "Yes," I said. "They know." Later, as I sat by the window watching the light fade over the downs, I took out my notebook and wrote the last line I would ever add to our chronicles. "Thus ends the record of Sherlock Holmes, the man who reasoned as precisely as he cared profoundly, and whose final lesson was that truth without mercy is only half a solution." When I closed the book, I fancied I heard again the faint hum from the meadow, a sound so steady, so gentle, that it seemed less like morning than like a benediction. The bells of the village church began to toll the Angelus. Their echoes floated through the dusk, blending with the bees' music until there was no separating one from the other. And I knew then that whether in stone, in song, or in the unending labor of the smallest of God's creatures, the harmony he sought still lived.